Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another scary story. Your place where we uncover the darkest mysteries in a calming and reflective way. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. Now, get comfortable and relax. My name is Dr. Evelyn Marsh. I'm a geologist. Rocks, dirt, the things beneath your feet. Those are my world. I don't scare easy. At least that's what I used to think. In 1985, I was hired to investigate something strange in the hills of West Virginia. An old quarry, long abandoned, filled with red stones that the locals refused to go near. They said the land was cursed, that the stones weren't natural, that people who touched them changed. I didn't believe in curses. I believed in science. The hike up to the quarry was steep, the trees closing in as if they wanted to keep me out. The air smelled heavy, like wet earth and something metallic, almost like blood. It was late afternoon when I arrived, and the sun cast long shadows across the hollowed-out pit. The place was dead silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own breathing. The stones were everywhere, jagged shards jutting from the earth, scattered across the ground like broken bones. They weren't like any rock I'd ever seen. A deep, dark red, almost black at the edges, with strange veins running through them like tiny cracks filled with something darker. I knelt, running my fingers over the surface of one. It was smooth, too smooth, warmer than it should have been. And then I heard it. A hum. Faint at first, like a whisper at the edge of hearing. I pulled my hand back, and the sound stopped. My pulse quickened. It had to be a trick of the wind. I picked up the stone. It was heavier than it looked. As I turned it in my hands, something changed. My fingertips tingle, a cold, crawling sensation spreading up my arms, and then a drop of something dark and thick seeped from one of the cracks. Blood. I dropped the stone. My breath hitched. No. It had to be some kind of mineral deposit. Not blood. Not really. I wiped my fingers on my jeans, but the stain wouldn't come off. A deep crimson smear sinking into my skin. I needed samples, needed to analyze them. That was the only way to explain this. I reached for my pack, pulling out my rock hammer. The metal felt solid in my grip, grounding me. I swung hard, shattering a chunk of the red stone. The hum returned, louder this time. The wind shifted, carrying a sound, soft, distant. A whisper, but not in English, not in any language I recognized. I stood slowly, heart pounding against my ribs. The quarry stretched out before me, empty, silent. But I wasn't alone. Somewhere in the shadows, something was watching. The silence pressed down on me like a weight, thick and unnatural, wrapping around my skin like an unseen hand. I tried to shake off the feeling, to convince myself it was just nerves, just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, something in me knew better. There was something here. Something just beyond the edges of my sight. I swallowed hard and focused on the shattered fragment of red stone at my feet. It lay in jagged pieces, the freshly broken edges glistening as if wet. I crouched down, reaching for one of the larger shards, but hesitated when I saw the dark stain still clinging to my fingers. It had dried now, or maybe it had sunk into my skin entirely. Either way, I could still feel it, a lingering sensation like a slow pulse beneath my fingertips. I told myself to move, to take the sample and leave. But my legs felt rooted to the spot. My muscles locked in place as my ears strained against the silence. The hum was still there, vibrating at the base of my skull, a sound too low for the wind to carry. It came from the stones. It came from beneath them. I forced myself to act, grabbing my specimen bag and shoving the broken fragment inside. The sooner I got back to my lab, the sooner I could analyze it, break it down into something explainable. I had just zipped the bag closed when I heard it. A whisper. Closer now. Not words, not really. Just breath and movement. I turned sharply, scanning the jagged walls of the quarry. The sunlight had already begun to slip behind the trees, stretching the shadows across the stone like long, grasping fingers. The hollow pit of the quarry yawned before me, its depths swallowing the last of the light, leaving the far edges shrouded in darkness. My gut twisted. I needed to leave, now! But as I took a step back, the ground beneath me shifted. A low groan rumbled through the earth, a deep guttural sound that sent a sharp jolt of fear through my chest. My instincts screamed at me to run, but it was too late. The earth gave way, crumbling beneath my boots, sending me tumbling backward. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. Dust rose around me in a thick, choking cloud, filling my mouth with the taste of dirt and stone. My head throbbed, a sharp pain blooming at the back of my skull. I gasped for air, coughing against the dust, my vision swimming as I tried to push myself upright. Then I saw it, the far wall of the quarry, where the rock had split open from the force of my fall. A gash in the earth, deep and jagged, exposing something beneath the layers of red stone. Something black, something old. I dragged myself forward, ignoring the ache in my limbs. My hands trembled as I reached out, brushing the edges of the exposed surface. It wasn't stone. It was something else entirely. It felt smooth, almost polished, like obsidian, but somehow alive. And then it moved. The surface rippled beneath my fingers, as if it were breathing, as if it had been waiting for me to find it. The hum grew louder, a deep vibration that rattled my bones. My pulse slammed against my ribs. I scrambled back, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The whispering returned, stronger now, filling the quarry with a voice that wasn't mine, a voice that had been buried for centuries. And it was calling my name. I scrambled backward, my hands slipping against the loose gravel as I fought to put space between myself and whatever was beneath that stone. My breath was coming fast, too fast, making my chest tight, as the weight of the air itself seemed to thicken, pressing down on me like an unseen force. The quarry had always been silent, unnervingly so, but now the absence of sound felt suffocating, as if the world beyond this place had simply ceased to exist. The only thing that remained was the hum, rising and falling in waves that made the back of my skull throb. I forced myself to my feet, my knees unsteady, my body protesting every movement as a deep ache settled into my bones from the fall. The quarry floor was uneven, littered with jagged shards of red stone that seemed to pulse under the dimming light, as though they were alive, waiting. I needed to get out. I needed to leave this place before the last sliver of daylight disappeared behind the hills and left me alone in the dark, with whatever was whispering my name. Turning toward the entrance of the quarry, I stumbled forward, pushing past the lingering dizziness. My truck was parked just beyond the tree line, and if I could just make it there, I could leave, pretend I never came, tell the people who hired me that the site was unsafe, that no scientific discovery was worth staying here another second. But as I took my first real step forward, a low rumble passed through the ground, a deep vibration that made my teeth rattle. And then the earth collapsed. The sound was deafening, a violent roar as the rock face behind me gave way, sending a cascade of stone and dirt rushing toward the quarry floor. I barely had time to react before a wall of dust engulfed me, filling my lungs, blinding me completely as I threw my arms over my head and dropped to the ground, hoping, praying, that I wouldn't be buried alive. The world shook, and for one horrifying moment, I thought the entire quarry would swallow me whole. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the collapse ended. The dust settled in thick, choking layers, turning the air into something tangible, something that clung to my skin and hair like a shroud. I coughed, struggling to clear my throat, my eyes burning as I blinked against the haze. My body ached, but nothing felt broken. I had been lucky, but when I turned toward the entrance, my stomach clenched with a cold, suffocating dread. The way out was gone. The landslide had sealed the only path back to the surface, leaving behind a solid wall of stone and debris. Panic flared in my chest, sharp and immediate, my mind racing as I stumbled toward the blockage, running my hands over the rough, unyielding surface as if I could somehow push my way through. My breath hitched, my heart hammering as a terrible thought settled over me like a shadow. I was trapped. The whispering returned, drifting through the dust-choked air like a breath against the back of my neck. Close. Closer than before. And I was no longer alone. The weight of the realization settled in my chest like a stone, heavy and unmoving, pressing down on my ribs with an unbearable force. I was trapped. There was no way out. No clear path back to my truck. No sign of anyone nearby who could dig me free. My mind raced, grasping for some kind of logic, some plan, some way to convince myself that this wasn't as bad as it seemed. But the moment I turned back toward the center of the quarry, that hope shriveled inside me like a dying flame. The red stones were different now. Before, they had simply been scattered remnants of whatever strange formation this quarry had uncovered, lifeless and inert, despite the unsettling hum that had emanated from them. Now, in the eerie half-light, they seemed to pulse, a slow, rhythmic throb, just beneath their jagged surfaces, like something alive struggling to break free. The ground beneath them was darker than before, streaked with something that glistened under the last traces of daylight. A thick, viscous liquid, seeping from the cracks in the rock. I took a step back, but the moment my boot touched the ground, a sound echoed through the quarry. It wasn't the whispering this time. It was something worse. A wet sound, like something shifting, peeling away from the earth itself. A deep, dragging noise that sent a shiver through my entire body, raising the hairs on the back of my neck. I turned sharply, my breath caught in my throat, my eyes darting across the quarry floor in search of the source. The dust was still settling, making it hard to see, but as it cleared, I finally noticed them. The shapes. At first, they didn't make sense. They were just dark figures rising slowly from the patches of liquid that had seeped through the stones, their forms uneven, jagged like something half-formed, something unfinished. But as they moved, as they began to take shape, I realized with a sickening dread what I was looking at. They were people, or at least they had been. Their bodies were twisted, their limbs wrong, as if they had been put together by someone who had only a vague idea of how human anatomy worked. Their skin, or whatever passed for it, was the same deep red as the stones, slick and wet as they pulled themselves free from the earth. Their heads lolled forward, their hollow eyes staring at nothing. But somehow, I knew they could see me. and then they moved. Their motions were jerky, unnatural, their limbs twitching as they staggered toward me, dragging themselves across the quarry floor with a slow, deliberate purpose. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my body refused to obey. My mind was caught in a tangle of disbelief and terror, unable to process what was happening, unable to understand how something like this could exist. One of them tilted its head, the motion sharp, almost mechanical, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Then its mouth opened. No lips, no teeth. Just darkness. An endless void where a face should have been. And from that void came a sound that didn't belong in this world. A whisper. Not one voice, but many, layered over each other, speaking in a language that was ancient and broken, a sound that scraped against the inside of my skull like nails against stone. My vision blurred, my balance wavering as the quarry itself seemed to shift beneath my feet. I had to move, I had to run, but as I turned, the whispering rose into something else. Laughter, hollow, echoing, and they were getting closer. The laughter twisted through the quarry like a living thing, curling around me, burrowing into my skull, making it impossible to think. It wasn't real laughter, not the kind that belonged to anything human. It was hollow, fractured, rising and falling in strange, uneven bursts, as if the things dragging themselves toward me were trying to remember how to make sound, how to imitate something they had long since forgotten. The air itself seemed to vibrate with it, a deep, rattling hum that grew stronger with every step they took, pulsing in time with the red stones scattered around the quarry. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my pack, for the hammer, for anything solid, anything real that could ground me in the face of whatever this was. My fingers closed around the worn wooden handle, my grip tightening as I forced my breath to steady, forcing myself to remember that I was a scientist, that there was always an explanation, always a way to break something down into pieces I could understand. But no amount of logic could change what was happening. No data could erase the figures standing before me, shifting and twitching as they pulled themselves fully from the earth. Their hollow eyes locked onto me with a hunger that sent ice spreading through my veins. I couldn't fight them. I knew that much. They weren't made of flesh and bone, and weren't bound by the same rules as the living. But if they had come from the stones, if the red rock had somehow birthed them, then maybe, just maybe, destroying it could stop them. It was a desperate thought, but it was the only one I had. I turned sharply, lifting the hammer, my muscles screaming in protest as I brought it down on the nearest red stone with all the force I could muster. The impact rang through the quarry, a sharp, splintering crack that sent a spider web of fractures racing through the stone's surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the hum faltered, just for a second, just long enough for me to feel it. The slightest shift in the air, the briefest hesitation in the things moving toward me. I didn't stop to think. I swung again and again, smashing the rock beneath my feet, breaking it apart until dark liquid seeped from the cracks, pooling at my boots in thick, sluggish streams. The figures convulsed, their bodies jerking violently, their whispering voices rising into something that almost sounded like pain. The figure on beneath me trembled, a deep, groaning noise splitting the air as the quarry itself seemed to react, as if the land was fighting against me. Then the stones began to multiply. Where I had shattered one, two more emerged, rising from the ground as though the earth itself was bleeding, as though the quarry was feeding on my destruction, growing stronger with every piece I tried to break. The figures straightened, their bodies no longer twitching, their movements no longer hesitant. They were whole now. They were ready. The realization struck me like a physical blow. There was no stopping this. The stones weren't the source of it. They were the symptom, a manifestation of something deeper, something older, something I had no hope of understanding. And I woke up. I turned, desperate, my mind racing for another solution, another way out. But the landslide had sealed my fate. The figures stepped forward as one, their shadows stretching long across the quarry floor, their voices merging into a single, terrible chant that reverberated through my bones. I tried to run. I didn't make it far. The last thing I saw was the darkness rushing toward me, swallowing the world whole. When the landslide was finally cleared, days later, they found nothing. No signs of me, no equipment, no shattered rock. The red stones were gone, as if they had never existed. But the ground, where the quarry had once been, was different. Stained. A deep, rust-colored red that wouldn't wash away. And in a small town miles away, a child picked up a strange, smooth stone from the dirt, turning it over in his hands as a faint hum filled the air. My father, Henry, was never a rich man. He worked hard, hands thick with calluses, mind sharp as steel. He dreamed of a better life for us, one where we didn't scrape by, one where he didn't feel powerless. So when news came that an estranged uncle had left us a mansion in New Orleans, he saw it as a sign, a gift, a symbol of his long-awaited success. The house was enormous, looming over us like a watching giant. A Victorian masterpiece, they called it. Tall, black iron gates. A wraparound porch with twisting wooden railings. The windows, deep-set, arched things, seemed too dark, as if they absorbed the light instead of reflecting it, but it was ours now. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air smelled old. Not just dusty or abandoned, but ancient, like time itself had rotted within these walls. The wooden floorboards creaked underfoot, the sound sharp, almost deliberate. The wallpaper, once elegant with swirling golden patterns, had begun to peel, revealing something darker underneath. Wood, but too smooth, almost like skin. "Do you feel that?" my mother, Evelyn, whispered beside me. I nodded. I did feel it. The house wasn't empty. It was waiting. But my father didn't believe in waiting. "It's perfect," he said, voice full of pride. "We'll fix it up. Make it ours." That night, as we settled into our rooms, the house shifted for the first time. I woke to silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy kind. The kind that presses against your ears like thick, suffocating cotton. My room was cold, colder than it had been when I fell asleep. I pulled my blanket tighter, but something was wrong. My door was open. I was sure I'd closed it. Positive. Beyond it, the hallway stretched longer than I remembered. The gas lamps flickered, their light dim and shivering. I swallowed hard, my pulse thudding against my ribs. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Coming from the end of the hall. I held my breath. Listened. Another step. Then another. A shadow passed in front of the nearest lamp. Tall. Wrong. Too thin, its arms unnaturally long, fingers dragging along the wallpaper. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The shadow stopped, turned, looked at me. I saw no eyes, no features, just a twisting darkness that pulsed like something alive. I blinked, just once, and it was gone. But the hallway wasn't the same. The doors had changed. My parents' room, which had been to the left, was now at the end of the hall. The staircase, once straight ahead, was nowhere to be seen. I stumbled back into my room, slamming the door shut, heart hammering. The house had moved. It wasn't just old. It was alive. The next morning, the house felt different, though I couldn't explain exactly how. The air was still heavy, thick with the scent of old wood, and something else I couldn't quite place. Something damp and lingering, like the breath of something that had been sleeping for too long. My father was already downstairs, his voice carrying through the halls as he spoke excitedly about our new life here, about all the things we would fix, about the history of the house, and how lucky we were to have inherited such a grand estate. I didn't feel lucky. I didn't say anything at first, not about the shadow, not about the way the hallway had changed overnight. I told myself I must have been dreaming, that my mind was playing tricks on me. Houses didn't just shift. Shadows didn't just move. But then I noticed my mother standing by the window, her face pale, her fingers gripping the lace curtain as she stared out into the morning fog that curled against the trees outside. She didn't even glance at me when I came to stand beside her. "I could have sworn," she started, then stopped, shaking her head as if trying to rid herself of a thought she didn't want to say aloud. I swallowed hard. "What?" She turned to me then, her blue eyes dark with uncertainty. "I thought the garden was on the other side of the house." I followed her gaze, and my stomach twisted. She was right. I remembered it too. The overgrown hedges, the stone fountain cracked and empty, the winding path that led toward the backyard. But now it was on the wrong side, as if the house had turned in the night, as if its very foundation had shifted while we slept. Before I could respond, my father called us into the dining room. The table was already set, a grand thing made of dark mahogany, its surface polished to a deep shine. My younger sister, Margaret, sat across from me, poking at her eggs with a frown. She was only 10, too young to understand the weight in the air, but I could tell she felt it too. That strange, creeping wrongness. "We should start cleaning up today," my father said between bites of toast. "The library is filled with old books, most of them probably worth something, and the parlor." A loud knock interrupted him, echoing through the house. We all froze. It wasn't the front door. The sound had come from deeper inside, from one of the rooms beyond the dining hall. My mother set her fork down, her hands trembling slightly as she looked toward my father. "Who could that be?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Father frowned, standing slowly. "No one. No one even knows we're here yet." Another knock, this time softer but insistent. The sound sent a shiver crawling down my spine. My father squared his shoulders and motioned for me to follow him. I hesitated but rose from my chair, glancing once more at my mother and sister before stepping into the dimly lit hallway. The house was eerily silent now, except for the creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. The knocking continued, steady, rhythmic, as if whatever was behind the door knew we were coming. We stopped in front of the study. I had never been inside, but I had noticed it the day before, the heavy wooden door carved with intricate patterns of vines and twisting roots. Now, in the pale morning light, I saw something else, scratches, deep grooves running along the bottom of the door, as if someone, or something, had clawed at it desperately, trying to get out. My father reached for the handle. "Wait," I whispered, grabbing his arm. He gave me a sharp look, shaking off my grip before twisting the knob. The door swung open with a long, groaning creak. The study was empty. Dust floated in the air, catching the light from the tall, narrow windows that lined the far wall. A massive desk sat in the center of the room, covered in yellowed papers and ink-stained books. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with old tomes whose titles were too faded to read. But there was no one there. And yet, I swore I could still hear the knock, the ghost of it lingering in the silence. My father stepped inside, his brow furrowed as he surveyed the room. "Probably just the old pipes shifting," he muttered, though there was no conviction in his voice. He picked up one of the books, flipping through the brittle pages before shaking his head and setting it back down. I remained in the doorway, my pulse hammering in my ears. The house had moved in the night. The garden had shifted. And now something had knocked from within a locked room. I didn't know how to explain it, but deep in my gut, I knew we were not alone in this house. That night the house was restless. It creaked and groaned as if settling its bones, but the sounds were not like normal house sounds. They were deliberate, thoughtful, as though the house was shifting itself just beneath our feet. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that the cold weight in my stomach was just leftover fear from the knocking at the study door that morning. But the moment I lay down in bed, I felt it again. That unsettling presence, the feeling of being watched, the air thick with something unseen but undeniably there. Sleep did not come easily, and when it did, it was thin and fragile. I dreamed of long hallways stretching endlessly before me, of doors that opened into nothingness, of walls that breathed in and out, as though the house itself was alive. I woke up gasping, my sheets damp with sweat, the room too dark, the air too still. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, straining to hear beyond the rapid beat of my pulse. And then I heard it. A slow, deliberate sound. Not quite footsteps, but not quite the normal settling of an old house either. It came from the hallway, just beyond my door, soft and dragging, as if someone were sliding their feet along the wooden floorboards. My breath caught in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the sound away, telling myself that if I didn't acknowledge it, it wouldn't be real. Then my door creaked. I froze, every muscle in my body locking into place. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could feel it, the presence beyond the threshold, standing just outside my room. The door hadn't opened, but it had moved, just slightly, just enough to whisper against the frame. I wanted to scream for my parents, but something in me, some deep, primal instinct, told me not to. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The door remained half a breath open, but whatever had been standing there, whatever had been watching, was gone. I sat awake until morning. At breakfast, my mother looked as though she hadn't slept either. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured herself a cup of coffee, and her eyes darted toward my father as though she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Margaret, too young to fully understand the weight pressing down on us, simply sat at the table, picking at her toast. My father, however, seemed unbothered, drinking his coffee and reading the newspaper, as though the house hadn't whispered to us in the dark. I pushed my eggs around my plate, appetite gone. I needed to say something, needed to tell them about the hallway, about the way the house had changed again in the night. I had memorized the layout when we moved in, but when I had finally gathered the courage to peek into the hallway at dawn, I had found it wrong again. My parents' bedroom, which had been just across from mine, was now further down the hall. Margaret's room, once at the far end, was suddenly closer. The staircase had moved again, twisting in a way that made no sense, leading down to a part of the house I didn't recognize. But before I could speak, my mother cleared her throat. "I don't think this house is right," she said softly, setting her cup down with a trembling hand. My father let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temple as if already exhausted by the conversation. Evelyn, we talked about this. It's an old house. It makes noise, it settles. Of course, things might seem different at night. Our eyes play tricks on us when we're not used to a place. My mother shook her head, her gaze locked onto his. No, Henry. I mean it. The house is changing. He scoffed, though there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice when he responded. Houses don't change, Evelyn. Margaret looked up, her brow furrowed. Then why is my window on the wrong wall? Silence fell over the room. My father set his newspaper down slowly, looking at her as if she had just spoken in a language he didn't understand. What do you mean? She frowned, stirring her spoon aimlessly through her cereal. Yesterday, my window was across from my bed. This morning, it's next to my dresser. She shrugged. I thought maybe I just remembered wrong, but her voice trailed off, and I could see it in her eyes. She knew she hadn't remembered wrong. None of us had. My father exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You're all just getting used to the house, that's all. His voice was firmer now, final, as though he could will the truth away simply by refusing to acknowledge it. I don't want to hear any more of this nonsense. My mother pressed her lips together, but didn't argue. Margaret went back to her cereal. But I knew. I knew my father was wrong. That night, I decided I had to prove it. When everyone else had gone to bed, I took a pencil and a sheet of paper from the study. I moved carefully, keeping my steps light as I crept through the halls, trying not to breathe too loudly, afraid of waking something that might be listening. The house was silent, except for the occasional crack and groan of shifting wood. I stood at the top of the staircase, the flickering gas lamps casting long, uneven shadows against the walls. I memorized every detail, every doorway, every archway. I took my pencil and began to sketch a quick map, marking the exact layout of the hallways, the placement of each door, the turn of the stairs. Then I folded the paper and slid it beneath my pillow. If the house moved again, I would know for certain. And when I woke up the next morning, I found the paper on my bedside table, unfolded, with a single change made to it. The hallways had shifted, and something, had crossed out my name at the bottom of the page and written a new one in its place. Welcome home. I stared at the paper for what felt like hours, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps as I traced the words written at the bottom. The handwriting was not mine. The ink, darker than the pencil marks I had made the night before, looked as though it had seeped into the very fibers of the paper, thick and deliberate. Someone had crossed out my name. Someone, or something, had replaced it with their own. But there was no name, just those two words. Welcome home. A sharp knock at my door made me flinch so hard I nearly dropped the paper. My heart leapt into my throat as I scrambled to shove it beneath my mattress. Are you awake? My mother's voice was soft but urgent, edged with something I didn't recognize. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to remain steady as I answered. Yeah. She hesitated, then pushed the door open slightly, peeking inside before stepping in fully. Even in the dim morning light filtering through my window, I could see that she looked worse than she had the day before. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, fingers twisting as if trying to hold on to something solid, something real. I need you to come with me, she whispered, her eyes darting toward the hallway as if she were afraid someone might be listening. I didn't ask questions. I just nodded, pushing back my blankets and stepping onto the cold wooden floor. I followed her out of the room, my bare feet making no sound as we moved through the hallway. The air felt heavier than before, thick with something unseen, something pressing against my skin like invisible hands. She led me to the study. The door was already open, swinging slightly on its hinges as though someone had just passed through. Inside, the air was colder than the rest of the house, and the morning light through the tall, narrow windows barely touched the darkness that seemed to pool in the corners of the room. And then I saw it. The walls had changed. Where there had once been shelves filled with books, there were now carvings. Deep, intricate etchings that spiraled along the wooden panels, forming patterns too chaotic to be decorative, but too purposeful to be meaningless. Some of them resembled roots, twisting and curling together in tangled knots, but others looked disturbingly like letters, words half-formed and incomplete. I stepped closer, my fingers hovering just above the surface. The grooves in the wood were fresh, as though they had been carved in the night, the raw edges splintering slightly. "What is this?" I whispered. My mother didn't answer. She was staring at the far wall, her face pale, her lips slightly parted. I turned to follow her gaze, and that was when I saw the portrait. It had not been there the day before. The painting was massive, taking up nearly the entire wall, its gilded frame cracked and peeling with age. But it wasn't the frame that made my stomach twist. It was the man in the painting. He was dressed in dark, formal clothing, the style older than the house itself. His face was long and narrow, his eyes deep-set and sharp, his mouth unsmiling. His hands rested on the arms of a heavy wooden chair, fingers long and claw-like, curled slightly as if ready to grip something unseen. But it was his eyes that held me frozen. They were wrong. They weren't just painted onto the canvas, they were too real, too focused, too knowing. They seemed to follow me, shifting slightly as I moved, the light catching in them in a way that should have been impossible. And then I saw the plaque beneath the painting. Architect Elias Wren, 1872. The name sent a chill through my bones. My mother took a slow, unsteady breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think this is the man who built the house." I didn't respond. I couldn't, because I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that he was still here. The house creaked around us, the sound deep and heavy, almost like a sigh. I turned back to the carvings on the wall, my pulse hammering in my ears, and for the first time I saw what they truly were. Not patterns, not meaningless scribbles. They were names. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Some carved deep and bold, others faint, as though time had begun to erase them. My mother reached out, her fingers grazing the wood, and I watched as she traced one of the names, her breath catching in her throat as she did. Henry Porter. My father's name. The air around us grew colder. The lamps flickered, their flames shrinking as if something unseen had drawn breath, pulling the very light from the room. My mother stepped back quickly, her face pale, her hands shaking. "We have to leave," she whispered. I turned to look at the portrait again, at the man who had built this house, who had designed it to be more than just walls and rooms and halls. The air crackled with something unseen, something waiting. And then I saw it. His hands had moved. In the painting, the architect's long fingers, once resting on the arms of his chair, were now gripping them. His knuckles white. His lips curled ever so slightly into something that might have been a smile, or might have been something else entirely. The house let out another deep groan, the floor beneath us trembling slightly, the walls seeming to breathe in and out as though alive. We weren't just living in the house, we were part of it, and it wasn't going to let us go. My mother grabbed my wrist, her fingers cold and trembling as she pulled me toward the door. I didn't resist. I couldn't. The walls felt too close, the air too thick, as if the house itself was aware of what we had just discovered. As we stepped back into the hallway, I realized that the gas lamps along the walls had dimmed, their flames flickering weakly, casting long, shifting shadows that didn't quite match our movements. The house was watching. We hurried toward my father's study, our footsteps too loud in the silence. The wood beneath our feet groaned as if reluctant to let us pass, as if the floorboards themselves were stretching, shifting. My mother's grip tightened as we reached the study door, and she shoved it open without hesitation. My father was inside, standing at his desk, hunched over a large, yellowed blueprint that I hadn't seen before. He looked up sharply as we entered. His eyes narrowed, irritation flashing across his face. But before he could speak, my mother released me and strode forward, grabbing the edges of the blueprint and turning it toward me. "Look at this," she said, her voice strained, her breath coming too fast. I took a step closer. The blueprint was unlike any I had ever seen. It showed the mansion, but not as it was now. The walls curved in unnatural ways, the rooms twisted, overlapping where they shouldn't. Staircases led nowhere, hallways stretched and bent like they were living things. But the worst part was the center of the design, where a massive circular chamber had been drawn, its walls marked with strange, curling symbols. It wasn't a house. It was something else. I swallowed hard. "What is this?" My father ran a hand down his face, exhaustion creeping into his expression. "It's the original design," he muttered, shaking his head. "Elias Wren's vision for the house." He tapped a finger against the circular chamber. This was meant to be the heart of it, but it was never built, at least not in the way it was drawn. The plans were dismissed as madness. My mother's voice was barely above a whisper. Then why does it feel like it was built anyway? The study door slammed shut behind us. We all jumped, my mother gasping, my father whipping around with wide eyes. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The door had closed on its own. No, not on its own. The shadows along the edges of the room thickened, shifting unnaturally, curling toward us like reaching fingers. The walls trembled, the gas lamps flickering wildly, casting twisting, writhing shapes against the bookshelves. Then came the laughter. A low, whispering chuckle, slipping through the cracks in the walls, curling beneath the floorboards, echoing from the ceiling. It wasn't loud, but it was everywhere, surrounding us, filling the room like a breath held too long. My father stepped back, his face pale. "What the hell?" The room tilted, not in a way that could be explained by logic or reason, but in a way that sent my stomach dropping, my knees buckling. The walls stretched, the floor twisted beneath my feet, and suddenly the study wasn't the study anymore. The bookshelves dissolved, the heavy desk faded, and the walls rippled outward, shifting, expanding, until we were no longer standing in a room at all. We were in the heart of the house. The circular chamber from the blueprint stretched around us, its walls impossibly tall, curving inward as if we were inside the ribcage of something massive. Symbols, the same ones from the blueprint, pulsed along the floor, carved deep into the wooden planks, glowing faintly with a sickly greenish light. The air smelled of damp earth and something metallic, something sharp and bitter. And in the center of the room, standing as though he had been waiting for us all along, was Elias Wren. He looked exactly as he did in the portrait. His dark suit was crisp, his long fingers curled around the head of a polished cane, his sharp eyes gleaming with something unreadable. But he wasn't just a painting anymore. He was real. My father took a step forward, his jaw clenched. "This house belongs to us now." His voice wavered only slightly, but I could hear the fear buried beneath it. Elias smiled. "Does it?" His voice was like rustling leaves, like wind slipping through cracks in a coffin. He lifted one hand, palm up, and the walls around us shuddered. The room tightened, the curved walls pressing inward, the air growing heavier, thick with the scent of dust and decay. "The house feeds," Elias murmured, stepping closer. "It was always meant to feed." His gaze flicked to my father. "And you? You are perfect. A man who refuses to see. A man who clings to control even as it slips through his fingers." He smiled wider, his teeth too sharp, too white. "You make the house stronger." The walls pressed closer. The symbols on the floor flared brighter. My mother clutched my arm, her breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. My father shook his head, his face hardening. "No, I won't." Elias raised his hand higher, and the house screamed. Not a sound, but a feeling, a deep, shuddering vibration that rattled my bones, that filled my chest with something cold and empty. The walls closed in, the air squeezed tight around us, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I thought the house would swallow us whole. Then, suddenly, light, bright, golden, blinding. The symbols on the floor cracked, splintering apart, and the walls stopped moving. The air thinned, the pressure lifting just enough for us to stumble backward. My mother yanked my hand, pulling me toward the door that had appeared where there had been nothing moments before. "Run!" she gasped. We didn't hesitate. My father was the last to move, his eyes locked on Elias, who simply stood there, watching, his expression unreadable. Then, as we burst through the door, the last thing I saw was Elias raising one long, pale finger to his lips, as if shushing us. Then the house let us go. We ran. Through twisting hallways, past rooms that had never been there before, down staircases that stretched too far, our feet barely touching the ground as the house groaned and shifted, as if trying to pull us back. But we didn't stop. And then, suddenly, we were outside. The cold night air hit my skin like ice. The mansion loomed behind us, its windows dark, its doors closed, silent, waiting. We never went back. We never spoke of it again. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of that house, of hallways stretching endlessly, of doors that open into nothing, of laughter, soft and whispering, slipping through the cracks in the walls. And I know the house is still waiting. My name's Jack, and I'm the overnight DJ at KBRN, a tiny, forgotten radio station in the Alaskan wilderness. Middle of nowhere. No real town nearby, just a handful of people scattered in cabins, braving the cold like ghosts on the edge of civilization. I keep them company through the night, spinning records, telling stories, taking the occasional call from some insomniac trucker passing through. It's late, past midnight, the kind of dark that feels thick, pressing against the windows, swallowing everything beyond the weak glow of the station's security light. The wind howls outside, rattling the thin walls. My coffee's gone cold, my cigarettes are almost out, and the snowstorm creeping in is promising to lock me in here for days. Then I hear it. At first it's just static, creeping into my headphones like a whisper from another world. My equipment's old, so I tap the dial, adjust the frequency. It doesn't go away. If anything, it sharpens. A low hum beneath the crackling white noise. Then, words. A voice, distorted and distant, slipping through the static. Find me. I freeze. The sound isn't coming from the usual channels, not from a caller, not from a station I recognize. Just those two words, warped and drawn out like someone speaking through water. I glance at the frequency, 104.6 FM. That's not right. That station doesn't exist. Not anymore. My fingers hover over the dial, debating whether to turn it, whether to pretend I didn't hear it. But my loneliness gets the better of me. Hello? I say into the microphone, my voice rough with hesitation. This is Jack, broadcasting from KBRN. Who's there? Silence. Only the wind outside, screaming like something alive. Then, click. Every light in the station flickers. A pop of static explodes in my headphones, sharp enough to make me rip them off. The voice returns, louder, closer. Find me. The hairs on my arms rise. My breath comes fast and shallow. I feel it then, something beyond the walls of the station, something waiting. I stand up too fast, my chair scraping the floor. I should turn it off, cut the power, leave. But where would I go? Outside, the storm has swallowed the world, so I sit back down, swallow the lump in my throat, and I do the only thing I know how to do. I keep broadcasting. All right, folks, I say, my voice only shaking a little. Looks like we've got some strange activity on the air tonight. If anyone out there can hear this, call in. Let's figure this out together. No calls come. No voices answer, except for the one in the static, repeating, growing clearer. Find me. The voice lingers in the static, stretching out like fingers reaching through a fog. I can't move, can't blink, can't breathe. The words repeat, softer this time, more like a sigh than a command. Find me. The station is small, just a single broadcast room, a back office, and a break room with a stiff old couch where I sometimes sleep when the roads are too iced over to drive home. But right now, it feels enormous, filled with a heavy silence pressing in from every corner, like something is waiting just out of sight. I tell myself the signal is nothing. A rogue frequency, maybe some old transmission bouncing through the atmosphere, picking up interference from a long-dead station. It happens, doesn't it? Waves travel. They don't just disappear. Sometimes they echo back. That's all this is. That's all it can be. But still, I can't bring myself to turn the dial. I glance at the phone, half expecting it to ring. The station doesn't get many calls at this hour, just the occasional trucker or fisherman killing time on the road. But tonight, the silence stretches on, unbroken. Outside, the wind screams through the trees, throwing itself against the walls in great heaving gusts. The power lines above the station creak, threatening to snap. I try to steady my breathing, pressing my hands flat against the desk, grounding myself in the worn wood beneath my fingers. The clock on the wall ticks, slow and deliberate. I tell myself to move, to do something, but my body feels heavy, my limbs unwilling to obey. Then, Just as I'm about to force myself to turn off the signal, the sound changes. It's not just a voice anymore. It's a rhythm, a pattern buried beneath the static. A pulsing, distant, almost like breathing. In, out. A steady inhale, a slow exhale, like someone just beyond the microphone, waiting, watching. I lean forward, pressing my ear closer to the receiver, straining to hear. Find me. The voice is louder now, less distorted. A woman. Her tone is not urgent, not desperate, but insistent, like she already knows I will listen. I pull back sharply, my chair rocking beneath me. A sharp gust of wind rattles the window beside my desk, and I glance outside. Snow is falling thick and fast, turning the world into a swirling white void. My truck is already buried up to the tires. Even if I wanted to leave, I couldn't. A flicker of movement catches my eye. A shadow, just beyond the glow of the security light. I can't make out a shape, only the impression of something standing just beyond the reach of my vision, still and silent in the storm. My stomach twists. It's just a trick of the snow, I tell myself. Just the wind shifting against the trees. But my fingers are ice cold where they grip the desk, and deep in my chest, something ancient and instinctive tightens, whispering, "You are not alone." The station feels smaller suddenly, walls pressing in, air growing thin. The static hums louder, filling the space between my ears, beneath my skin. The equipment in front of me crackles, dials twitching without my touch. And then the voice speaks again, not from the receiver, not from the radio, but from the speakers right in front of me. "Jack?" I shove my chair back so hard it topples over. My breath comes fast, sharp, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs like it's trying to escape. The voice had shape this time, real and undeniable, spoken in the room with me. My name hangs in the air, dissolving into the hum of the radio waves. The lights flicker, the overhead bulb buzzing like an angry insect. The wind outside wails louder, battering against the walls as if it wants to rip the whole station apart. I turn in slow, shaking increments, scanning every shadow, every corner. Nothing. Just me. Just the empty station and the howling dark pressing against the glass. I tell myself I imagined it. The mind plays tricks when you're alone too long, when you let yourself listen too closely to the spaces between sounds. I reach for the dial with numb fingers, ready to shut the whole thing down. Then the phone rings, a shrill, piercing sound that shatters the silence, so sudden and violent that I flinch, knocking my knee against the desk. I stare at it, pulse thundering in my throat. It rings again, and again. I don't want to answer it. Every nerve in my body screams at me to let it go, to unplug the damn thing, to run. But where would I go? There is nowhere. The blizzard has swallowed the world, and I am trapped inside it, wrapped in static and snow. I reach for the receiver with a hand that isn't steady, lifting it slowly to my ear. For a moment, there's nothing but breathing. Deep, slow, a mirror of the sound behind the static. Then the voice whispers, soft and patient. "You found me." I can't speak. The words sit heavy on my tongue, trapped beneath the weight of my own breath. My hand grips the receiver so tightly that my knuckles ache, but I can't bring myself to loosen my fingers. The voice on the other end is quiet now, the steady sound of breathing filling the space between us, deep and rhythmic, as if whoever, or whatever, is on the other end is waiting for me to respond. But I don't. I can't. My own breath is shallow, coming too fast, uneven, and shaking. My mind scrambles for an explanation, any logical reason for what's happening, but all I can hear is the echo of those last two words. You found me. The voice is wrong, not in tone or pitch, but in a way that I can't quite place. It sounds like someone I should recognize, someone familiar, yet there is something off about it, something stretched and distorted, like a reflection in a broken mirror. I squeeze my eyes shut, trying to force myself to move, to break the silence, to end this. But before I can gather the strength to slam the phone down, the voice speaks again. It's closer now, as if the speaker has leaned in, pressing their lips right against the mouthpiece. You were listening. You heard me. It isn't a question. It's a statement, a quiet certainty that sends a cold shiver creeping down my spine. I try to steady my breathing, try to convince myself that this is nothing more than a prank, some late-night drifter with a radio transmitter messing with me. But the rational part of my brain is no longer in control. The room feels too small, the air too thin. I force myself to speak, though my voice comes out hoarse and uneven, barely more than a whisper. Who is this? The breathing stops. The line goes silent. For a brief, fleeting moment, I think the call has ended, that I've imagined all of it, that my own exhaustion and isolation have finally cracked something loose inside me. But then, I hear it. Something faint in the background, buried beneath the silence. A sound I can't quite place at first. Something distant, warbling and mechanical, like an old radio tuning itself through empty airwaves. Then, beneath it, something else. A song. Barely more than a hum at first, soft and distant, as though playing from a place far away, lost in static. But as it grows louder, I recognize it. An old tune, something I used to hear as a kid, back when my mother would leave the radio playing in the kitchen. The sound drifting through the house like a ghost of another time. I haven't heard it in years. How do they know this song? The receiver in my hand grows slick with sweat. I want to move, to do anything other than sit here, listening to this sound unravel across the line. But my body refuses to cooperate. I feel stuck, frozen in place, as if the station itself has swallowed me whole. Then, a whisper. Not from the phone, not from the radio, from somewhere inside the room. Jack. I drop the receiver. The plastic clatters against the desk, bouncing once before settling into silence. The song is still playing through the speakers, tinny and distant, but the phone itself is dead, the steady hum of an empty line humming through the air. My breath comes ragged now, my chest rising and falling too fast, too sharp. The storm outside has grown worse, the wind howling like something alive, shaking the walls of the station with such force that I half expect them to collapse around me. The security light outside flickers wildly, casting long, shifting shadows across the windows, shapes that twist and stretch in ways they shouldn't. I try to tell myself to turn off the radio, to cut the signal, to end whatever this is before it can go any further. But I can't bring myself to move. The old speakers crackle, the dials on the equipment twitching ever so slightly, and for a moment I think I hear something beneath the song. A second voice, layered just underneath, so soft I can barely tell if it's real, or if my mind is filling in the spaces with its own paranoia. Let me in. I spin toward the door before I even realize what I'm doing, my heart slamming against my ribs. The small window in the station's front entrance is fogged over, ice creeping along the edges of the glass, but beyond it, just barely visible through the swirling snow, I see movement. A figure. Not moving toward the door, not knocking, just standing, watching. My breath catches in my throat, and for a long, agonizing moment, neither of us moves. The shadow beyond the door remains perfectly still, dark and featureless, a void against the whiteness of the storm. I want to call out, to demand to know who's there, but the words won't come. Then, in the silence, the voice speaks again. Not from the radio, not from the phone, from right behind me. You left the door unlocked. The words slide down my spine like ice water, soaking into my bones before my brain can even process them. I don't turn around. I can't. My body has gone stiff, locked in place, every nerve screaming at me that if I move, if I even breathe too loudly, something terrible will happen. The voice is close. Too close. I can feel it in the air behind me, thick and wrong, pressing against the back of my neck like the ghost of a hand. The station is silent except for the wind outside, rattling the walls, and the faint, distant hum of static still whispering through the speakers. My heart is hammering, pounding so violently I swear it must be shaking the floor beneath me, but I force myself to swallow down the panic, to gather whatever scraps of logic I still have left. There is no one behind me. There can't be. The station is locked. The doors are closed. There is nowhere for anyone to hide. But I don't check. I can't. Because if I turn around, if I look, then I will have to see it. Instead, I focus on the door ahead of me, on the frozen glass fogged over with the breath of the storm, on the shadow still standing motionless beyond the security light. The figure hasn't moved, hasn't knocked, hasn't made any indication that they even see me. But I know they do. I can feel it. The silence stretches, thick and unbearable. My ears ring. My fingers twitch against the edge of the desk, itching to do something, to act. But I don't know what. The air in the room is heavy, pressing in on me like a weight, as though the very walls are closing inward, drawing me into the center of something I don't understand. Then something shifts. A creak. Soft, deliberate. A floorboard bending beneath a weight that isn't mine. My stomach drops. There is someone in the room. I jerk forward without thinking, moving too fast, nearly knocking over my chair in my desperation to put space between myself and whatever is behind me. My knee slams into the edge of the desk, sending a sharp bolt of pain up my leg, but I barely feel it. My pulse is roaring in my ears now, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts. The radio crackles. Not static this time. Something else. Something worse. A laugh. Low, amused, familiar. My laugh. I freeze. The air inside the station has turned frigid, colder than the storm outside, so cold that my breath curls visibly in front of my face, mixing with the fog on the windows. The shadow beyond the glass finally moves. A slow, natural tilt of the head, just enough to make my stomach clench with something far worse than fear. The sound of my own laughter continues to leak from the speakers, warped and stretched, looping back on itself in a way that makes my skin crawl. I want to shut off the radio, to rip the power from the wall, to silence. Whatever this is, before it can continue. But I can't seem to move. Then the door handle rattles. Not a knock, not a slow test of the lock. A full, deliberate turn of the handle, as if whoever, whatever, is outside waiting. A deep, instinctual terror takes over, a primal kind of fear that overrides all sense and logic. My body moves before my brain can catch up, before I can think about whether the door was really locked or whether I just assumed it was. I lunge for it, throwing my full weight against the frame just as the handle clicks, just as the door begins to open. The impact rattles through me, knocking the breath from my lungs. The door doesn't slam shut completely. It wasn't open enough to make a sound, but I can feel something on the other side, something pressing back. The laughter in the speakers stops. The room goes deathly still. I don't move. I can't move. My hands grip the doorframe so tightly that my nails dig into the wood. The cold from outside seeps in through the crack, the air between me and the figure beyond the door impossibly thin. Then, so quietly I almost don't hear it, something whispers my name, not from outside, from behind me, right next to my ear. I shove against the door with everything I have, slamming it fully closed, twisting the lock so hard it nearly snaps. The moment it's done, I stumble backward, away from the door, away from the voice, away from the thing that was just inches from me. The radio bursts to life again. The same song from before, still warped, still wrong. But now, there are voices beneath it. Not one, not two. Dozens. Layered on top of each other, whispering in a chorus that doesn't belong to this world. I grab the nearest chair and shove it beneath the doorknob, my hands shaking so violently that it takes me 3 tries to wedge it in properly. I don't know if it will help. I don't know if anything will help. Because the voice, my voice, is still playing from the radio, and the shadow beyond the door hasn't left. The chair beneath the doorknob feels flimsy, like a child's attempt at holding back the tide, but I don't have anything else. My breath is coming too fast, too ragged, my chest burning from the effort of holding it in, as if breathing too loudly might somehow let it in. The shadow outside hasn't moved, still standing just beyond the frozen glass, watching, waiting. But the thing behind me, the thing that spoke my name, it is still here too. I can feel it, the weight of its presence thick in the air, pressing against the back of my skull like invisible fingers. The radio is still playing that song, my voice woven into the melody, laughing in places I never laughed, speaking in tones that aren't quite mine. The layers of whispers beneath it are rising, growing louder, words overlapping and stretching in unnatural ways, forming sentences that don't make sense, phrases that slip away the moment I try to understand them. The dials on the equipment are twitching again, shifting without my touch, the numbers spinning through dead frequencies as if something else is controlling them. The lights overhead flicker wildly, buzzing like angry insects, casting the room into brief, shuddering darkness between flashes. I force myself to move, inching backward, pressing myself against the farthest wall, putting as much distance as possible between me and the door, between me and the unseen thing in the room. My hands are shaking so badly that I can barely keep them still. I don't know what to do. There is nowhere to go. Even if I made it outside, the blizzard would swallow me whole. There is no road, no help, no other living soul for miles. A sharp click echoes through the station. The sound of the doorknob. Turning again. But the door is locked. I watch, frozen, as the knob continues to turn. Not in quick, jerky movements, but slow, deliberate, as if the lock itself is meaningless, as if the thing on the other side knows that nothing I do will keep it out forever. The chair beneath the handle shudders, the wooden legs scraping against the floor, inching out of place. My stomach twists violently. I press my back harder against the wall, willing myself to disappear into it, to sink into the plaster and escape whatever is happening. The radio crackles sharply, the voices inside it peaking, overlapping into a tangled mess of sound that makes my skin crawl. Then, just as suddenly as they began, they stop. The station is silent. Only the wind remains, screaming outside, rattling the windows in their frames. The lights settle, humming quietly overhead, casting long, trembling shadows across the floor. The doorknob is still. The chair remains wedged beneath it, though it has shifted slightly, no longer as secure as it was moments ago. I don't trust the silence. It is too quiet. The static on the radio is gone now, replaced by something worse, a voice. Not the whisper from before, not the layered chorus of unknown words. This one is clear, steady, coming through the speakers as if it belongs here. It is mine. Not warped, not stretched. My exact voice, speaking calmly into the microphone. "This is Jack," it says. "If anyone can hear me, I need help." My breath catches in my throat. That is not me. I step toward the desk, towards the microphone I haven't touched since this nightmare began, towards the equipment that is now running a broadcast. I did not record. My own voice continues, steady and measured, the way I would normally sound when speaking to a late-night audience, as if nothing is wrong, as if I haven't spent the last hour trapped in this nightmare. "I'm trapped inside the station," the voice says. "There's something out there. I don't know what it wants. I think it's watching me." I reach for the power switch with shaking fingers, ready to cut the broadcast, to silence whatever this is before it can continue. But before I can touch it, the voice speaks again. "But it's okay," my voice says, "because I let it in." The chair beneath the door scrapes violently against the floor. The lights go out. The door swings open. The last thing I hear before the darkness swallows me whole is my own voice, whispering softly from the speakers, calm and patient, as if explaining something simple to an old friend. "I found you." The blizzard clears by morning. The radio station stands silent beneath the weight of fresh snow, untouched except for the single open door swaying slightly in the wind. The equipment inside is destroyed, the broadcast room a mess of shattered dials and burned-out wiring, as if something tore through it in a blind fury. But the radio signal still plays. It is weak at first, nothing more than a faint hum on the edge of dead air. But as the hours pass, the sound strengthens. Then, a voice. A new one. Someone else. A DJ, drawn to the mystery, sitting down in front of the microphone, ready to take over the abandoned station. The sound of the radio crackles, and from somewhere deep within the static, a familiar voice rises, repeating, waiting. "Find me." That was the first thing I noticed about the cabin. I pulled up the long, winding dirt road just as the first flakes of snow began to fall. The place was smaller than I expected. Just a single-story log cabin with a slanted roof, tucked deep into the woods like it had been forgotten by the rest of the world. The trees loomed tall around it, their bare branches scratching at the sky. The whole place felt still. Too still. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. This was it. My last chance. My publisher had made it clear. Either I finished this damn book, or I might as well kiss my career goodbye. And if my career went, so did everything else. The money, the house, whatever fragile pieces of my life I'd managed to hold together after the divorce. I sighed and rubbed a hand over my face. "Just a cabin," I muttered to myself. "Just a couple of weeks. You can do this." The wind howled as I stepped outside, biting through my jacket. I grabbed my bags and trudged up to the front door, the snow crunching under my boots. The key was already in my pocket. I'd picked it up from the rental office that morning. I slid it into the lock, turned it, and hesitated. Something felt wrong. The cabin was old, sure. It had probably been here for decades. But as I stood there, I swore I could hear something. Just beneath the sound of the wind, faint and distant. A whisper. I turned sharply, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. The wind picked up again, rattling the branches. That's all it was, just the wind. Shaking my head, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like old wood and dust, the air thick and stale. A fireplace sat cold and empty against the far wall, and an old leather couch faced it, looking like it hadn't been sat in for years. The floor creaked beneath my boots as I walked further in, setting my bags down by the small wooden desk near the window. This was where I'd write. This was where I'd get my life back on track. I glanced around the room. The walls were covered in old wooden panels, dark with age. And as I stood there, I felt it again. That strange, creeping sensation, like someone was standing just behind me, watching. I turned quickly. Nothing. Just the empty cabin. I let out a breath and ran a hand through my hair. "Jesus, get a grip," I muttered. "You're alone. You wanted to be alone." I unpacked quickly, trying to shake the unease. My laptop is on the desk, a bottle of water beside it. No alcohol. Couldn't have that temptation around. A few notebooks, some pens. Then, finally, I sank down onto the chair and stared at the blank page on my screen. Hours passed. The storm outside thickened, wind howling against the cabin. I barely noticed. My fingers hovered over the keys, but nothing came. My mind was a mess of static. The words wouldn't come. And then, a sound. I froze. It was faint, almost too soft to hear. But it was there, a whisper, low, gentle, coming from the walls. I swallowed hard and turned my head slowly. The room was empty. The fireplace, the couch, the desk. Nothing had changed. But the whispering, it was still there. I stood up, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Hello?" Silence. I forced out a breath, shaking my head. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was the wind outside, sneaking through cracks in the wood. But as I turned back to my desk, the whispering came again, and this time it was clearer. It was saying my name. I told myself I was imagining things. That was the only reasonable explanation. It had been a long drive, and exhaustion was playing tricks on me. The wind outside had a way of wrapping around the cabin, slipping through unseen cracks, creating strange noises in the silence. That was all this was. Nothing more than my own tired mind twisting the sound of the storm into something unnatural. But even as I sat back down at my desk, forcing myself to focus on the blank page in front of me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whisper had been clear, unmistakable, almost intimate in the way it formed my name. It hadn't been the wind. It hadn't been the creaking of the old wood settling. It had been a voice. I turned my head slowly, scanning the room, listening so hard my own breathing sounded too loud. The whisper didn't come again. just the steady moan of the wind outside, the occasional soft thud of snow sliding from the roof. The room looked the same, dimly lit by the old lamp on the desk, shadows stretching long against the walls. There was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the tightness in my chest, the way my skin prickled like something unseen had brushed against me. With a slow breath, I stood and walked to the small kitchenette on the other side of the cabin. Maybe I just needed something warm to settle my nerves. The cupboards were mostly empty, except for a few basic supplies left behind by the rental company: instant coffee, a couple of cans of soup, a bag of rice. I reached for the coffee, my hands still unsteady as I filled the kettle and set it on the tiny stove. The click of the gas lighter echoed through the quiet, the flame flaring blue before settling into a steady glow. As I stood there waiting for the water to boil, I let my gaze drift across the cabin again. It wasn't much, just a single main room with the kitchen in one corner, the living space in the other, and a short hallway leading to a single bedroom and a cramped bathroom. The walls were dark with age, the wood rough and uneven in places, deep grooves carved into the surface like old scars. I hadn't noticed them before, but now, standing here in the dim light, they looked almost deliberate. I stepped closer, running my fingers along one of the grooves. The wood felt cold beneath my touch, smoother than I expected, as if the marks had been worn down by time. They weren't scratches, not from furniture or careless renters. They were patterns, shapes, letters. I pulled my hand back quickly, my heart stuttering in my chest. The marks weren't deep enough to be fully legible, but I could see hints of words, faded with age, almost completely swallowed by the wood itself. I leaned in, squinting in the dim light. "Help me." The words were barely there, more of an impression than actual writing, but once I saw them, I couldn't unsee them. I ran my fingers over them again, feeling the indentations, the way the letters had been scratched into the wood by someone desperate, someone who had needed to be heard. A sharp whistle broke the silence, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. The kettle. I exhaled shakily, turning away from the wall and pouring the boiling water into a chipped ceramic mug. My hands still weren't steady. I needed to stop this. I was letting my imagination run wild. I was a writer, after all. My mind was trained to spin stories from nothing. That was all this was, an old cabin full of history, my exhaustion twisting shadows into something sinister, my own paranoia filling in the blanks. I sat back down at the desk, cupping the warm mug between my hands, staring at the blinking cursor on my laptop screen. I tried to focus, tried to push everything else aside, but my mind kept circling back to the whisper, the voice that had called my name, the fact that I had recognized it. It had been years since I'd last heard her voice, but there was no mistaking it, the softness of it, the way it had curled around my name like a familiar lullaby. My mother. A shiver crawled up my spine, and I set the mug down with a dull thunk, my pulse pounding in my ears. It wasn't possible. She had been dead for nearly 15 years. I had buried her. I had seen the casket lower into the ground, watched the dirt swallow the last piece of my childhood. I had tried for years to forget the way she had looked at me that night, the way her voice had cracked when she had whispered my name for the last time. I closed my eyes, rubbing my temples. I wasn't going to do this. Not here. Not now. I needed sleep. That was all. A good night's rest, and everything would feel normal again in the morning. The storm would pass, and the cabin would be nothing more than an empty, quiet place where I could finally write. I forced myself to shut the laptop and stand, stretching my stiff muscles before heading down the short hallway to the bedroom. It was just as small as the rest of the cabin, just a simple wooden bed with a thick, musty-smelling comforter, a nightstand with an old lamp, and a single window looking out into the endless stretch of trees. The wind howled against the glass, rattling it in its frame, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something move in the darkness beyond the trees. I blinked, stepping closer to the window, my breath fogging the cold glass. There was nothing there, just the shifting shadows of the storm, the branches bending under the weight of the wind. With a tired sigh, I pulled the curtains shut and climbed into bed, willing my body to relax against the stiff mattress. I closed my eyes, focusing on my breathing, trying to ignore the way the wind seemed to whisper as it pressed against the cabin. And just as sleep finally started to pull me under, I heard it again. The whisper. Closer this time, right against my ear. My name. I jolted awake, my body stiff, my heart hammering so hard in my chest that for a brief, disoriented moment, I thought something was physically pressing down on me. The room was dark, the only light coming from the thin slit between the curtains, where the moon barely pushed through the heavy storm clouds. My breath came in short, uneven gasps, the echo of that whisper still ringing in my bars, as if the voice had been right there beside me, so close that I should have felt the warmth of someone's breath against my skin. I sat up too quickly, the blood rushing to my head, making my vision swim for a second before settling. The cabin was silent now, eerily so, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to acknowledge that I had heard it. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my hands gripping the edge of the blanket like a lifeline, trying to steady the slow unraveling in my mind. It wasn't real. It couldn't have been real. The logical part of me fought against the gnawing fear growing in my stomach, telling me it was just the remnants of a dream, a trick of exhaustion, my own thoughts turning against me in the silence. But deep down, I knew. I knew that I hadn't been asleep when I heard it. I had been hovering on the edge, yes, but not gone, not lost in some dreamscape. It had been real, my name, whispered in a voice I had not heard in 15 years. I forced myself to move, swinging my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet pressing against the cold wooden floor. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably, and as I exhaled, I swore I could see the faintest wisp of breath curling in the dim light. I shivered and ran a hand through my hair, my fingers trembling slightly as I pushed myself up to stand. I needed water, something to pull me out of my own head. I moved carefully, each step slow and deliberate, as if I expected the floor to shift beneath me. The hallway seemed longer in the dark, the walls closer, the air heavier, thick with something I couldn't name. It was ridiculous. It was just a cabin, old and creaky, full of history and shadows. Nothing more. But as I reached the main room, my breath caught in my throat. The lamp on my desk, the one I had switched off before going to bed, was on. The warm yellow glow pooled across the wooden surface, illuminating my open laptop, the screen flickering faintly. I was sure I had shut it. My hands had hovered over the keyboard for hours, the words refusing to come, the weight of exhaustion finally forcing me to close the lid with frustration before heading to bed. Now, not only was it open, but there was text on the screen. My fingers twitched at my sides as I stepped closer, my pulse pounding in my ears as I read the words typed across the document. I hear you. I stared at the screen, my breathing shallow, my skin crawling with something I couldn't shake. The words were there, clear as day, sitting in the middle of the blank page, waiting. I hadn't written them. No one else was here. I reached out, my hand hesitating over the keyboard before finally pressing the delete key. The letters vanished, swallowed by the emptiness of the screen, but the uneasy weight in my chest remained. Something was wrong with this place. I turned sharply, scanning the room, my eyes darting to the corners where the shadows stretched long against the wooden walls. The whispering had stopped, but the silence was worse, thick and expectant, like the cabin itself was waiting to see what I would do next. My gaze drifted toward the markings on the wall, the ones I had noticed earlier, but convinced myself were nothing. I stepped toward them, hesitating only briefly before running my fingers along the uneven grooves again, tracing the faint impression of those desperate words. "Help me." I pressed my palm against the wall, feeling the rough texture of the wood beneath my skin. And for a brief moment, I thought I felt something move beneath my hand, a slow, pulsing shift, like the wall itself was breathing. I yanked my hand back, my pulse skittering, my breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. This wasn't just exhaustion. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. Something was here. A gust of wind rattled the window behind me, and I turned so quickly I nearly lost my footing, my heart slamming against my ribs. The storm outside had thickened, the snow coming down in dense sheets, blurring the world beyond the glass. I could barely make out the dark outline of the trees, their branches swaying violently under the force of the wind. But as I stood there, staring into the swirling white, my stomach dropped. There was something else out there. A shape. It stood just beyond the reach of the cabin's dim light, barely visible through the curtain of falling snow. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I stepped closer to the window, my breath fogging against the glass as I tried to make out more details. It was tall, its form indistinct, shifting slightly as the snow swirled around it. At first, I thought it might have been a tree, a trick of the storm twisting the branches into something vaguely human. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became. It wasn't a tree. It was standing too still, too perfectly upright, and even though I couldn't see its face, I knew it was looking right at me. I swallowed hard, every instinct in my body screaming at me to step back, to move away from the window, to pretend I hadn't seen anything at all. But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the floor, my breath shallow, my body locked in place by something deeper than fear. Then, without warning, the figure took a step forward, just one. And the lights in the cabin flickered. A deep, guttural creak echoed through the walls, the sound vibrating through the floorboards, through my bones. And for the first time since I had arrived, I realized the truth. I wasn't alone in this cabin, and I never had been. I stumbled backward from the window, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the cabin groaned around me, the old wooden walls shifting and creaking as though something inside them was stirring awake. The lights flickered again, a slow, rhythmic pulsing, as if the cabin itself had a heartbeat, steady and deliberate, each flash of darkness stretching longer than the last. My mind raced, scrambling for logic, for reason, for any kind of explanation that didn't involve the thing outside, the thing that had moved, that had stepped forward, that had made itself known to me. I turned away from the window, my hands shaking as I grabbed my phone from the desk, my fingers fumbling over the screen. But there was no signal. The little red icon in the corner taunted me, confirming what I had already feared. I was completely cut off. The storm outside had swallowed the world, and I was trapped in this place, alone with whatever was watching me. No, not alone. The thought came unbidden, an intrusive whisper slithering through my mind, and I couldn't stop myself from looking back at the walls, the carvings, the messages. The desperate plea that had been etched into the wood. Help me. The letters rough and jagged, as if the person who had made them had been in a hurry, as if they had been running out of time. The air in the cabin felt heavier now, thick with something unseen, something that pressed against my skin like invisible hands, curling around my throat, making it hard to breathe. My ears were ringing, a sharp, high-pitched whine that I couldn't tell was real or just inside my head. And beneath it, layered deep within the silence, I heard it again. The whisper. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was here. Inside. I spun around wildly, my eyes darting across the room, searching for the source. But there was nothing. Just the flickering lamplight, the shifting shadows, the dull hum of the storm beyond the walls. But I could feel it, a presence thick and oppressive, something that didn't belong, something that had been waiting for me to notice it. And then the voice came again, soft and delicate, curling through the air like smoke, wrapping around my name with a familiarity that sent ice through my veins. Daniel. I choked on my breath, stumbling backward, my spine hitting the desk with a dull thud, sending my laptop crashing to the floor. The whisper had come from behind me, impossibly close, like someone had leaned in, their lips just inches from my ear. I turned sharply, my pulse hammering, but the room was empty. Nothing but the cold air pressing in around me, the distant howl of the wind outside. I forced myself to swallow, my throat dry, my entire body trembling. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The wall. The wood was shifting, the grain twisting, the dark knots in the surface stretching like widening pupils, as if the cabin itself was watching me. The grooves, the carvings, the scratches, they were moving, rearranging themselves, the letters forming new words right in front of me, like an unseen hand was etching them in real time, carving deeper and deeper into the wood. Confess. The word was stark, raw, the edges splintered and uneven, as though it had been forced into existence. A shudder rolled through me, and I took an unsteady step back, shaking my head. Confess what? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. The room answered with a sound I hadn't heard before. A deep, resonant groan, not from the wind, not from the storm, but from the walls themselves. The cabin was breathing now, inhaling and exhaling, the wood expanding and contracting, the structure shifting beneath my feet like something alive. And then the voice came again, no longer a whisper, but something stronger, something older. You know what you've done. The floorboards creaked, a slow, deliberate sound, and I turned just in time to see the shadows move. Not flickering, not shifting with the lamplight, moving. They rose from the edges of the room, stretching upward, unfurling like dark tendrils, forming shapes, vague at first, but then clearer, more defined, more human. Faces emerged, hollow and empty, their eyes nothing but deep black pits, their mouths twisting in silent screams, as if they were being pulled from some unseen void, as if they had been trapped here for far too long. One of them stepped forward, and my breath caught in my throat. It looked like my father, but it couldn't be. My father had died when I was 16, and even in life, he had never looked like this, his face stretched too thin, his skin too pale, his lips cracked and bloodless. His body moved unnaturally, his limbs too long, his fingers curling like claws, his head tilting in a slow, deliberate motion, as if studying me. I shook my head violently, my chest tightening. "No," I whispered. "You're not real." The figure took another step, its feet making no sound against the wooden floor. Another shape moved beside him, and my stomach lurched violently. It was my mother. Her eyes were sunken, her hair limp and tangled, her mouth curled in something that might have been a smile if it weren't for the jagged, gaping darkness where her teeth should have been. She lifted a hand, reaching for me, her fingers twitching, her voice nothing more than a hollow echo. "Confess." I stumbled back again, my knees hitting the edge of the couch, my body folding into itself as I gasped for air. My head was spinning, my vision darkening at the edges, panic closing in like a fist. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the cabin was closing in around me, the walls shifting, the ceiling lowering, the shadows multiplying, their faces emerging from every corner, every crevice, whispering, whispering, whispering. "Confess, Daniel. Confess." The words crawled over my skin, slithered into my ears, filled my lungs like smoke, and then the walls began to bleed. The wood split open, deep red seeping from the cracks, thick and slow, dripping onto the floor, pooling around my feet. The smell hit me all at once, coppery, metallic, suffocating. The air was wet with it, the cabin groaning and trembling, the figures stepping closer, their voices rising in a fevered chant. "Confess! Confess! Confess!" My mind splintered. I opened my mouth to scream, and then everything went black. I woke up to the sterile smell of antiseptic, the hum of distant voices, and the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. The light above me was too bright, too white, burning through my closed eyelids like a knife, slicing through darkness. My body felt heavy, my limbs sluggish, as if I had been underwater for too long, trapped beneath the surface, my lungs on the edge of bursting. Slowly, painfully, I forced my eyes open. The ceiling above me was smooth and pale, the kind of bland, clinical white that could only belong to a hospital. The walls were the same, bare and cold, with only a single window partially covered by beige curtains that barely let in the dim gray light from outside. A steady snow was still falling, thick and endless, coating the world in silence. I turned my head, wincing at the sharp pain that lanced through my skull. A nurse stood near the doorway, speaking in hushed tones to a doctor whose back was turned to me, their voices too soft for me to make out. My throat was dry, raw, as if I had been screaming for hours, and when I tried to swallow, it felt like sandpaper scraping against my skin. The last thing I remembered was the cabin, the walls splitting open, the blood pooling at my feet, the shadows pressing in from all sides, my mother's voice, my father's face, the whispering filling my head until I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. And then nothing. I swallowed hard and tried to push myself up, but my arms barely obeyed me, weak and trembling as if I had been lying here for days. The nurse must have noticed my movement because she turned quickly, her eyes widening slightly before she rushed over to me. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice calm but laced with something I couldn't quite name. "Take it easy. You're safe. You've been through quite an ordeal." I blinked at her, my brain sluggish, my thoughts tangled. "What happened?" My voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. She hesitated, glancing toward the doctor, who finally turned to face me. He was an older man, his silver-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose, his expression carefully neutral in that way doctors mastered, the kind of practiced calm that immediately made me uneasy. "You were found unconscious in a remote cabin," he said, his voice measured. A group of hikers came across the property yesterday and saw smoke coming from the chimney. When they went to check, they found you on the floor, unresponsive. You were severely dehydrated and suffering from mild hypothermia. I stared at him, my mind struggling to piece it together. "No," I croaked. "No, that's not what happened. The cabin, it wasn't empty. There was something there." The nurse and the doctor exchanged a quick glance. That glance made my stomach twist, the way their eyes flickered with something. Was it pity? Doubt? I didn't know. "You were alone when they found you," the doctor continued, his voice careful. "There were no signs of anyone else in the cabin." I shook my head, my breathing shallow. That wasn't possible. I remembered it all too clearly. The voices, the shadows, the blood. Unless none of it had been real. A cold sweat broke out along my spine, my pulse hammering in my ears. My mind had played tricks on me before. I had spent years drowning it in alcohol, numbing myself from the memories I wanted to forget. But this had felt different. This had felt real. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to steady my thoughts, trying to separate what was real from what wasn't. But the more I tried to pull the pieces apart, the more they tangled together, blurring at the edges, overlapping like two versions of the same story fighting for dominance. I forced myself to look at the doctor again. "The walls," I said, my voice shaking. "There were carvings in the wood. Words. Help me. Did they see that?" He frowned slightly, flipping through the clipboard in his hands. "The hikers mentioned the cabin was in poor condition, old, weathered, but no mention of carvings." I exhaled slowly, my chest tight. That didn't make sense. I had seen them. I had felt them. But if they weren't there, was I losing my mind? I turned my head, staring at the snow falling beyond the window, my thoughts spiraling in slow, endless circles. Maybe it had been some kind of breakdown. The isolation, the stress, my own past creeping back into my head like a sickness I could never fully shake. Or maybe the cabin had taken something from me. The doctor spoke again, his voice pulling me back. "You need to rest, Mr. Sullivan. Your body has been through a great deal. If you continue experiencing any confusion or distress, we can have someone come in to talk to you." I nodded weakly, not trusting myself to speak, not trusting myself to say the wrong thing, to let them see how deeply unsettled I still was. The nurse adjusted something on the IV line running into my arm, her touch gentle but efficient. "Try to get some sleep. We'll check on you soon." I didn't respond. I wasn't sure I could. As they left the room, closing the door softly behind them, I turned my head back toward the window, watching the snow swirl against the glass. The wind outside howled, low and distant, like something calling from far away. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe, to push the memories away, to convince myself it had all been in my head. But then, just as the silence settled in around me, I heard it. A whisper. Soft. Close. Right by my ear. And this time, it wasn't my mother's voice. It was the doctor's. And he said my name. My eyes snapped open, my heart hammering, my breath caught in my throat. But the room was empty. Everything was still. I turned my head slowly, my gaze drifting toward the bedside table. My personal belongings were there. My phone, my wallet, the small notebook I always carried. And next to it, my laptop. The screen was open. The document is still displayed, and there, typed at the very bottom of the page, were the last words I had written. The walls are still whispering. When I first arrived in Black Hollow, the town was asleep beneath a heavy sky. The kind of sky that swallows the sun whole, leaving nothing but an aching gray. I liked that. It suited me. I drove past the skeletal remains of an old gas station, the sign creaking as it swung in the wind. Past shuttered windows and peeling paint, a place forgotten by time, just like me. My new home sat at the edge of the woods, a crooked little thing with ivy strangling the walls and a porch that groaned beneath my weight. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough for someone like me, someone who had nothing left. Inside, the air was thick with dust, but I didn't mind. I unpacked slowly, carefully, as if arranging my things just right would bring some kind of peace. As if placing my son's picture by the bedside would make the silence hurt less. I was wrong. That first night, I woke to the sound of laughter, faint, drifting through the trees. Children's laughter. It started soft, barely there. Then it grew, rising and falling like waves against the shore. It was light, playful, but something about it made my skin crawl. It had been months since I had heard a child's laughter. And yet, there it was, spilling through the darkness like a secret meant only for me. I pressed my forehead to the window. The woods stretched out beyond my backyard, black and endless. I could see the trees swaying, but the wind was still. Then I saw them, figures moving between the trees, small darting shapes, children, playing. My breath caught. I couldn't see their faces, only the pale flicker of limbs as they danced between the trunks, their laughter curling into the night like smoke. A trick of the mind, I told myself. I had barely slept since the funeral. My grief played cruel games. That's all it was. And yet, the laughter followed me to bed. It lingered in the corners of my dreams, whispering secrets in voices that weren't quite right. I dreamt of little hands pulling at my dress, of cold fingers wrapping around my wrist. I dreamt of the woods swallowing me whole. When I woke, the house was silent. The kind of silence that presses against your ribs, heavy and knowing. I stepped outside. The morning was thick with fog, curling low around the trees. The world felt smaller, as if the sky had crept closer in the night. That's when I saw them again. The children. They stood at the edge of the woods, still and watching, their heads tilted slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. My heart lurched. They were identical, each one of them. Same height, same pale faces, same blank expressions. I swallowed hard, gripping the porch railing until my knuckles ached. Then one of them took a step forward. I almost called out, but something in my throat seized tight. And then they scattered, gone in an instant, slipping into the fog like they had never been there at all. I stood there for a long time, my son's name on my lips, though I never spoke it aloud, because for just a moment before they vanished, I could have sworn I saw his face among them. The next morning, the world felt different, like a painting slightly tilted on the wall, just enough to unsettle without being immediately obvious. The sky was still swollen with thick, gray clouds, the kind that held the weight of rain, but never let it fall. The trees stood motionless, despite the occasional gust of wind that should have made their branches tremble. And the house, my new home, pressed in around me, its wooden bones creaking as if settling into my presence, as if adjusting to me. Or maybe waiting. I tried to go about my morning like nothing had happened, like I hadn't stood on my porch in the eerie dawn light, staring at a group of children who all looked exactly the same, like mirrored copies of one another. Like I hadn't, just for a second, thought I had seen my son's face among them. That part I didn't allow myself to think about for too long. The kitchen smelled stale, like the ghosts of old meals long forgotten. I busied myself making coffee, pouring the dark liquid into a chipped mug I had found in the cabinet. As I took a slow sip, I told myself I would go into town today, find a grocery store, maybe even talk to someone. I had barely spoken a full sentence to another person in weeks, and though the silence had been a kind of comfort at first, it was beginning to stretch too thin. As I stood by the window, staring out at the trees, I caught myself searching for movement. My stomach twisted when I realized I was hoping to see them again. The children. But the woods were empty, the fog thinner now, but still clinging low to the ground, like it had no intention of leaving. I turned away quickly, grabbing my coat from where I had tossed it over a chair, and stepped outside. The town wasn't far, just a short drive down a winding road that cut through the dense woods. The trees pressed in from either side, their bare branches reaching toward each other like desperate fingers trying to intertwine. Black Hollow was small. The kind of town that looked as though it had been built all at once, decades ago, and then left to slowly crumble under the weight of time. The streets were mostly empty, the few shops lined up along the main road barely showing signs of life. A grocery store, a hardware shop, a diner with a flickering neon sign that simply read, "Eat." Inside the store, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic. A bell jingled as I stepped inside, and almost immediately I felt eyes on me. An older woman behind the counter watched me without pretending not to. Her hair was gray, pulled into a tight bun, her face lined with deep creases that made her expression unreadable. "New in town," she said, not as a question, but as a fact. I nodded, hesitating before answering. "Yeah, just moved into the old house on the edge of the woods." The woman's lips pressed together in a way that made me instantly uneasy. She didn't look surprised. She didn't ask which house, didn't ask why I had moved here. Instead, she just gave a small nod, like she had already known. "You'll want to be careful," she said after a moment, ringing up the few things I had picked up. Bread, milk, some canned food. I frowned, shifting my weight. "Careful of what?" Her eyes flickered toward the window, toward the line of trees in the distance. "The woods," she said simply. "Don't go wandering too far." A chill slid down my spine, but I forced out a small, humorless laugh. "Not much of a wanderer," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure they were true. The woman didn't smile. She simply bagged my items, pushed them across the counter, and said nothing more. The ride home felt longer than it should have. The trees seemed taller, darker, the road narrower. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sky had deepened into an ugly shade of gray, the promise of night already curling at the edges. As I stepped out of the car, my breath caught in my throat. They were there, standing just beyond the tree line, watching. My body tensed, a sharp pulse of fear striking through me. But this time, I didn't turn away. I forced myself to look at them, to really look. They were still. Too still. Their bodies rigid, their faces pale and expressionless. And then, almost in unison, their heads tilted. Just slightly, just enough to make my stomach churn. I took a slow, hesitant step forward, the cold air biting at my skin. My pulse pounded against my ribs as I squinted through the fading light, trying to make out their faces. And that was when I saw him. My heart stopped. My breath hitched, because there, standing among them, was my son. His small frame, his familiar tousled hair, his big, dark eyes. Eyes that should have been filled with life, with warmth, but were instead black. Black and hollow. A choked sound clawed its way out of my throat. My knees nearly buckled. This isn't real. This can't be real. And then, just like before, they scattered. One moment they were there, and the next they were gone. But this time, they left something behind. A single footprint in the dirt. Small, familiar, and fresh. I didn't move for a long time. I couldn't. My feet felt like they had been buried in the cold, damp earth beneath me, as if the ground itself had decided to hold me in place. My breath came in short, uneven bursts, the kind that made my chest ache, the kind that made my vision blur at the edges. The single footprint in the dirt was too perfect, too fresh, its edges still sharp, not yet softened by the wind or the settling dust. It was small, unmistakably a child's. But more than that, it was familiar, in a way that made my stomach twist into knots. I had memorized the way my son's feet had pressed into the ground when he ran barefoot through the backyard on hot summer evenings, how he had left patterns in the mud after sudden rainstorms, tiny prints that I had always found so endearing, so precious. I knew the shape of his steps. And this one looked exactly the same. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look away, to pull my gaze from that terrible, impossible proof that something was wrong, that something was here. The woods loomed in front of me, dark and endless, the last of the evening light struggling to push through the tangled branches. A low breeze stirred the leaves, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought I heard something moving, something shifting between the trees. But when I strained to listen, there was only silence. A thick, waiting silence. I turned abruptly, my heart pounding against my ribs as I stumbled back toward the house. My hands fumbled with the keys as I reached the front door, fingers clumsy and cold. Hen! I finally shoved the door open. I stepped inside and locked it behind me with shaking hands. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that made every small sound feel amplified. The ticking of the old clock in the hallway, the faint creak of the floor settling under my weight. I stood there for a long time, my back pressed against the door, trying to slow my breathing, trying to shake the feeling that something had followed me inside. I told myself I wouldn't look outside again, that I wouldn't press my forehead to the cold glass of the window, wouldn't let my eyes search the darkness for movement. But I did, and they were there. Closer this time. Standing just beyond the fence, their small, pale faces barely visible in the dim light. My stomach clenched as I realized there were more of them now, more than before, their identical figures stretching in a crooked line along the trees. Their bodies were rigid, unnaturally still, their hollow black eyes fixed on me. My breath hitched in my throat, but I refused to look away. I couldn't. If I looked away, if I blinked, I felt like something terrible would happen, something I couldn't name. And then, all at once, they moved. Not like children should move, not in that clumsy, joyful way that I had once known so well. They moved together, perfectly synchronized, like puppets on invisible strings. Their heads tilted in the same slow, unnatural motion, their limbs bending just slightly, in a way that sent a chill rushing through me. I stepped back from the window, my heartbeat hammering in my ears, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, fingernails digging into my palms. They were playing with me. I didn't know how I knew it, but I did. This was a game to them. I turned away, squeezing my eyes shut, willing the image of their empty faces to fade from my mind. I needed to think. I needed to understand what was happening, why they were here, why they looked the way they did. But the only thing I could think about, the only thought that clawed its way to the surface, was my son. Had I really seen him? Or was my grief twisting things, making me see what I so desperately wanted to see? I pressed the heels of my hands against my temples, trying to push the thoughts away. I needed sleep. Maybe if I slept, everything would make sense in the morning. Maybe they wouldn't be there. Maybe it had all been some cruel trick of the light, some cruel trick of my mind. But deep down, in the place where logic had already begun to unravel, I knew. They would still be there, and they were waiting for me. Sleep did not come easily that night. I lay in bed with my back pressed against the mattress, staring at the ceiling as shadows curled in the corners of the room, shifting slightly as the wind moaned against the house. My mind would not be still, would not allow me the escape of unconsciousness, no matter how tightly I shut my eyes. Every time I drifted close to the edge of sleep, I heard it. The laughter. Soft at first, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. It wove through the walls like a thread unraveling from something ancient and unseen, slipping through the cracks and curling around me. It was light, playful, but wrong. There was no real joy in it, only something empty, something hollow. I pulled the covers up to my chin, my breath shallow, my body rigid with the kind of fear that made my limbs feel weighted and useless. I told myself it wasn't real, that it was just my exhausted mind playing tricks on me. But the longer I lay there, the louder it grew. The laughter didn't come from a distance this time. It wasn't floating in from the woods. It was closer, much closer. It was inside the house. My stomach turned to ice. I forced myself to sit up, my fingers clutching the blanket like a lifeline. The darkness in the room felt different now, heavier, as if it was pressing down on me, pushing against my ribs. I strained to listen, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears. Then came the sound of small, bare feet padding softly across the wooden floor. My breath hitched violently in my throat. The sound was unmistakable. The light but deliberate rhythm of footsteps moving just beyond my bedroom door. Slow, careful. As if whoever, or whatever it was, didn't want to wake me. Or maybe, I thought, my skin crawling, maybe they wanted to see how long they could move before I noticed. I sat frozen, my fingers digging into the sheets, waiting for the sound to stop. Waiting for something to make sense. But it didn't stop. The footsteps continued, circling just outside my door, pausing every few seconds, as if listening. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the doorknob turned. A sharp, rattling twist. I choked on a breath, my entire body recoiling, my pulse hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. The door was locked. I had locked it. But that sound, that awful, deliberate sound of someone trying the handle, of something testing the barrier between us, sent a wave of nausea rolling through me. I forced myself to move. I slid out of bed, my feet barely making a sound against the cold floor as I backed toward the window. My hands found the curtain, fingers curling into the fabric as I debated whether to look outside, whether to see if they were still there. But before I could decide, the laughter stopped. The silence was instant, suffocating. And then came the whisper, soft, right against the door. "Mama!" The word slid through the wood like a breath of frost. I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth, choking back the sob that wanted to escape. My legs nearly gave out beneath me, my body shaking violently as I pressed myself against the wall. I knew that voice. I would have known it anywhere. It was my son's. A tear slipped down my cheek, hot and unwelcome. My mind screamed at me that this wasn't real, that it couldn't be real, but my heart, my broken, desperate heart, clung to the sound of that voice with everything it had left. I wanted to open the door. I wanted to fling it wide, to see his face, to pull him into my arms. But I knew, deep in the marrow of my bones, that whatever was waiting on the other side of that door was not my son, and it was not going to leave. I don't remember how long I stood there, my back pressed against the cold wall, my breath coming in shallow, trembling gasps. The silence outside my door stretched impossibly long, a waiting thing, thick with something unseen and unbearable. My mind kept repeating that one word, that impossible, beautiful, horrifying word that had slipped through the wood like a ghost, curling around me like a hand reaching from the past. Mama. I wanted to believe it was him. My boy. My sweet, laughing boy, who had been taken from me too soon, whose absence had hollowed me out and left me wandering through life like a woman made of shadows. But I wasn't that naive, was I? I wasn't the kind of person who believed in miracles. Not anymore. And yet, my hand inched toward the door, my fingers hovering over the lock, aching with the need to turn it. Because if there was even the smallest chance, if there was even a fraction of hope that it could be him, how could I not open the door? A soft knock. Just once, just enough to make my breath hitch, to make my knees buckle. Then another whisper. Lower now, almost pleading. Mama, please. My hand trembled as it gripped the doorknob. The metal was ice beneath my palm, sending a shiver up my spine. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to will away the twisting, gnawing dread in my gut, trying to block out the memories of my son's voice, the way he had once clung to my legs, begging me not to leave for work, the way he had giggled when I scooped him up in my arms and told him I would always come back. But this wasn't him. I knew it. I knew it in the way the air in the room felt heavier, thicker, like I was sinking into something unseen. I knew it in the way the wind outside had stopped, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And I knew it in the way my heart clenched, a deep and awful certainty blooming inside me. I did not turn the lock. Instead, I whispered his name. Just once, just to see if it would respond. Silence. A long, awful silence. And then, without warning, the knob twisted violently, rattling so hard the entire door shuddered in its frame. I stumbled back with a strangled cry, my body colliding with the dresser, sending a picture frame crashing to the floor. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would shatter inside my chest. The thing on the other side of the door let out a slow, rattling breath. And then, all at once, the footsteps retreated. The sound of small, bare feet slapping against the wooden floor, growing fainter and fainter until there was nothing left but the distant creak of the front door swinging open. And then silence. I don't know how long I stood there, shaking, staring at the door as if it might move again. The house felt unbearably empty, the kind of emptiness that made my skin crawl, as if something had just left, but not entirely. I forced myself to move, my limbs stiff and trembling as I crept toward the window. The woods were waiting, and so were they. The children stood in the tree line, perfectly still, Their identical faces turned toward the house, toward me. Their black, hollow eyes glistened in the pale moonlight, empty and endless. There were more of them now, so many more, and they weren't alone. At the center of the group, standing slightly apart, was him, my son. He stared at me with that same expressionless face, his arms hanging limply at his sides, his feet planted firmly in the dirt as if he belonged there, as if he had always belonged there. A sob clawed its way up my throat, but I swallowed. Down, shaking my head as I backed away from the window. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I needed to leave. Now! I grabbed my coat, my bag, my keys, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts as I forced my legs to move, rushing toward the front door. My fingers fumbled with the lock, yanking it open so hard it slammed against the wall. The cold night air hit me like a slap, sending a sharp shiver through my body as I stumbled onto the porch. But I didn't make it to my car. The moment my foot touched the bottom step, I froze. They had moved. The children were closer now. Much closer. No longer standing at the edge of the woods, but lining the yard, forming a silent, unmoving barrier between me and the road. And my son, if that thing wearing his face could even be called that anymore, was standing directly in front of me, close enough to touch. "Mama," he said again, his voice soft, distant, a voice that was his, but not. I took a slow step backward, my pulse roaring in my ears. "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice barely audible. His head tilted slightly, and for the first time, something changed in his expression. A flicker of something unreadable, something ancient and knowing. "You belong with us now," he said. A cold wind swept through the yard, rustling the trees, lifting my hair, but the children did not move. They stood there, waiting, watching. I turned, heart pounding, and tried to run back inside, but the door slammed shut before I could reach it. The windows darkened, as if something had swallowed the light from within. My breath came in sharp, gasping bursts as I turned back toward the yard, toward the thing that had once been my son. He lifted his small, pale hand toward me, his black eyes endless and empty. And then I felt it. A shift, a pull, something deep inside me unraveling, something being taken. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came. Darkness pressed in, cold and smothering. And then, nothing. When I woke, I was in my bed. The house was silent. The sky outside was pale, the first hints of dawn creeping over the horizon. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, a terrible, grief-fueled nightmare. But when I turned my head, my breath caught in my throat. The mirror across the room reflected a face that wasn't mine. It looked like me, but it wasn't. The eyes were too dark, too empty, hollow. A slow, eerie laughter drifted through the air, curling around me like mist. And from the woods, the children waited. I rose from the bed, my body moving on its own, my feet carrying me toward the door. The last thing I remember was stepping outside and walking toward the trees, the laughter growing louder, the cold sinking deeper, until I was no longer afraid, until I belonged. It started with a letter, a thick, yellowed envelope sealed with red wax, the kind you only see in old movies. When I saw my name scrawled across it in dark ink, my stomach twisted. I didn't need to open it to know what it said. My father was dead. I should have felt something. Grief, sadness, even relief. But all I felt was cold. My father, Victor Rousseau, had been a distant, looming figure in my childhood. He was the man who owned Rousseau's doll emporium, the shop that had haunted my nightmares since I was old enough to dream. I hadn't seen him in over a decade, not since I left home, but the memories never left me. The way he used to sit in his workshop for hours, whispering to his dolls, the way their glass eyes gleamed in the dim candlelight, the way he used to say they were his real children. And now that shop was mine. I should have burned it to the ground. But when I saw how much it was worth, how much collectors would pay for my father's art, greed overpowered my fear. I told myself I could handle it. Just go in, take inventory, sell everything, and leave. Simple. It wasn't. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell. Dust, aged wood, something faintly metallic beneath it all. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of time. The shop was exactly as I remembered, rows upon rows of dolls staring from glass cases, shelves lined with delicate porcelain faces, their painted lips frozen in quiet smiles. I told myself they were just dolls, inanimate, harmless. Then I saw it, a single doll, sitting on the front counter. It hadn't been there when I left as a child, yet it felt familiar. Its face was too lifelike, its glass eyes an unnatural shade of blue, so light they were almost white. The hair was dark, wispy, and something about it sent a shiver down my spine. I swallowed and reached out, intending to move it aside. The moment my fingers brushed its tiny hand, something clicked deep within the shop. I froze. The lights flickered. A slow creak echoed from the back room, like an unseen weight shifting. My breath came faster. I told myself it was old wiring, settling wood, but I knew better. I turned to leave. The door wouldn't budge. I pulled harder. The knob twisted, but it was like something on the other side was holding it shut. I glanced back at the counter. The doll was still there, sitting perfectly still, but its head had tilted. Just slightly, as if it were watching me. And then, in the heavy silence, I heard it. A soft, childlike giggle. The sound was faint, almost too soft to be real, like a whisper caught in the drafty corners of an old house. But I knew what I had heard. My breath hitched, my fingers still gripping the door handle, knuckles turning white. The giggle lingered in the air, stretching out the silence, making it unbearable. I turned back slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs, scanning the shop for any sign of movement. The rows of dolls sat in their places, staring blankly from their glass cases, their tiny painted mouths frozen in expressions that now seemed eerily knowing. The doll on the counter hadn't moved. Or at least it hadn't moved. Again! Its porcelain face was still tilted slightly, those pale, glassy eyes reflecting the dim light of the shop. But I felt it watching me. A cold shiver ran down my spine, my body screaming for me to leave, to turn and force the door open no matter what, but something stronger kept me rooted to the spot. Curiosity, perhaps, or the sickening realization that I had stepped into something far beyond my understanding. I took a breath, trying to steady myself, and released the doorknob. If I was stuck here, I needed to stay calm. There had to be a reasonable explanation for everything. The flickering lights, the shifting sounds, even the giggle. Old buildings made noises, and my mind was playing tricks on me because I had spent my childhood fearing this place. That was all. That had to be all. Forcing myself to move, I took cautious steps deeper into the shop. my boots creaking against the wooden floor. My gaze flickered over the dolls on the shelves, their beady little eyes following me as I walked past. I knew it was just a trick of the light, a common effect when too many reflective surfaces were crammed together, but the unease in my chest tightened anyway. There were hundreds of them, small ones, large ones, some with delicate silk dresses, and others in simple cloth tunics, their faces hand-painted with meticulous precision. They were beautiful in a way, but there was something unnervingly human about them, something too lifelike in the way their fingers curled, the way their lips parted just slightly, as if they were waiting to whisper secrets. I told myself not to be ridiculous. These were just antiques, handcrafted and valuable, and nothing more. My father had been a craftsman, obsessed with detail. Il and his dolls were some of the finest in the world. That was why collectors would pay a fortune for them, why I was standing here now instead of walking away like any sensible person would. I just needed to catalog them, take pictures, and then call a buyer. I would be gone before I had time to let my imagination get the better of me. But as I approached the backroom door, I hesitated. This was where he had spent most of his time, locked away with his creations, working long into the night. I remembered peeking through the keyhole when I was a child, seeing his hunched figure illuminated by candlelight, his hands moving with a precise, almost mechanical rhythm. I had never been allowed inside. Not yet, he used to say. Not until you're ready. I wasn't ready now either, but I couldn't ignore the nagging pull of unfinished business. The back room held the key to all of this, to the shop, to the strange noises, to the awful feeling curling in my gut. If there was an explanation, it would be in there. Reaching out, I placed my hand on the wooden door and pushed. It groaned open, revealing a room shrouded in shadow, the air thick with dust, and something else, something bitter and metallic, like old blood. My stomach twisted as I stepped inside. The workshop was just as I remembered, cluttered with wooden limbs, glass eyes, and fabric scraps. Shelves lined the walls, filled with paints, brushes, and tiny tools, all arranged in neat, obsessive rows. But the thing that drew my attention, the thing that made my breath catch in my throat, was the chair in the center of the room. It was an ordinary wooden chair, worn with age, but sitting upon it was another doll, larger than the others, its head bowed forward, dark hair spilling over its face. And even though I had not seen this doll before, even though I had no reason to recognize it, a sickening familiarity swept through me. My hands trembled as I reached forward, fingers twitching as I gently brushed the hair aside. My own face stared back at me. My breath hitched in my throat as I stumbled back, my hand flying away from the doll as if burned. The air in the room suddenly felt too thick, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't shake off. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but no matter how I turned it over, no matter how many times I blinked, the truth remained the same. The doll's face was my own. The same high cheekbones, the same slightly upturned nose, the same full lips that I had inherited from my mother. Even the faint scar above my right eyebrow, the one I had gotten as a child when I fell against the edge of the kitchen table, was there, painted onto smooth porcelain. A deep, gnawing dread coiled in my stomach as I stared at the doll. It wasn't possible. It wasn't logical. My father had never seen me as an adult. He had only known me as a child before I ran away, before I cut all ties. But this doll was me, as I was now. The shape of the face, the details, the eyes. Those pale, glassy blue eyes, so light they were almost white, the same as the doll on the front counter. A strange, choking sound left my throat, something between a laugh and a sob. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe the stress of coming back here, of stepping into this cursed place, was making me see things that weren't there. I forced myself to take a step forward, my legs trembling beneath me, and reached out again, this time forcing my fingers to make contact with the porcelain skin. It was cold, unnaturally so, and far too smooth. Not like the old, cracked dolls in the shop. This one was new. And then, as if in response to my touch, the head shifted ever so slightly. I yelped, stumbling back again, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would break through my ribs. My eyes darted to the door, calculating the distance, but something held me there, some terrible fascination that wouldn't let me look away. The doll's head had only moved a fraction of an inch, but it had moved. There was no doubt in my mind. The silence in the workshop pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. Then, just as I was about to bolt, something clicked. A sharp, deliberate sound, like the winding of a tiny mechanism, the kind of sound an old-fashioned wind-up toy makes when it's being set in motion. The doll's lips parted. No voice came from it, no sound, but something about that tiny, deliberate movement sent ice flooding through my veins. My father's words came back to me in a whisper. Unbidden. Unwanted. Not yet. Not until you're ready. I wasn't ready for whatever this was. I would never be ready. I turned and ran, nearly tripping over my own feet as I burst out of the workshop, slamming the door behind me. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I pressed my back against the wood, my fingers digging into the grain. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of here. Now. But as I turned toward the front of the shop, my stomach dropped. The doll on the counter was gone. A sick, twisting feeling coiled in my stomach as my eyes darted across the shop, searching desperately for the doll that had been sitting on the counter only minutes ago. The space where it had been was empty, the wooden surface bare except for a faint outline in the dust. Proof that something had been there. My breath hitched, my pulse hammering against my skull as I took a slow, hesitant step forward, my ears straining for any sound, any movement, any sign of where it could have gone. But the shop was deathly silent. I forced myself to swallow, trying to steady my breathing, but the air felt thick and stale, as though something unseen had been exhaling in the room for far too long. My fingers curled into my palms, nails digging into my skin as I turned my gaze to the rows of glass cases lining the walls, each one filled with porcelain faces staring blankly outward. My heart pounded as I scanned them, a horrible thought creeping into my mind before I could stop it. Had one of them been empty before? Were all those dolls in their proper places? Had they always been arranged like that? Or had something shifted while I was in the workshop? The weight of so many tiny, unblinking eyes pressing against me sent a cold shiver down my spine. I took another step forward, my boots creaking against the floorboards, and that tiny noise, just the simple sound of my own movement, felt deafening in the heavy silence. I exhaled shakily, my breath fogging slightly in the cold air. I didn't understand how it could be this cold inside when the summer heat still lingered just outside the shop's walls, but everything about this place felt wrong, as though time had forgotten it, as though the air itself had been preserved along with the dolls. I tried to push the thought away, tried to tell myself that maybe I had knocked the doll off the counter by accident. Maybe it had fallen to the floor and rolled somewhere out of sight. That was logical. That was reasonable. My mind was just playing tricks on me, feeding off childhood fears I should have left behind years ago. But as I hesitantly crouched down, my hands shaking as I reached beneath the counter, my fingertips brushing the dust-covered floorboards, I already knew what I was going to find. Nothing. The doll wasn't there. It wasn't anywhere. A sharp, suffocating panic rose in my chest, my body urging me to turn and run, to get as far away from this place as possible. I needed to leave. I needed to get out. The door might have been stuck earlier, but maybe that had just been my own fear making me weak. Maybe if I just pulled harder, if I threw my weight against it, I could force it open. I stood too quickly, my vision swimming, and turned toward the exit. But the moment my eyes landed on the door, my blood turned to ice. The sign in the window, the one that had read "closed" when I first arrived, had flipped. It now read "open." Its reflection visible in the glass, illuminated by the flickering street lamp outside. But I hadn't touched it. The realization sent a bolt of terror through me, a cold, sinking dread that wrapped around my lungs like a vice. I staggered backward, my legs trembling beneath me, my mind screaming at me to run, even though every part of my body felt frozen in place. And then, just as I was trying to convince myself that I was imagining things, that none of this was real, something moved in the reflection. A small figure, just barely visible in the dim light, standing perfectly still in the center of the shop behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My entire body locked up, my breath caught in my throat, my skin crawling with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The reflection showed only the vaguest outline, small, childlike, unmoving, but I knew. I knew what it was. The missing doll. A cold whisper of air brushed against the back of my neck, and then, just beneath the shallow gasps of my own breathing, I heard it again, that soft, childlike giggle. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My entire body had locked into place, every nerve screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to listen. The giggle had been soft, barely more than a breath of sound, but it was enough to make my skin crawl, enough to send cold, biting terror curling through my veins. I could see the figure's reflection in the glass, standing perfectly still just behind me, its shape too small to be anything but the missing doll. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, that maybe my mind was playing games with me, twisting the shadows into something that wasn't there. But the air around me had changed, thick and heavy with something I couldn't name, something wrong, something unnatural. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat, a frantic rhythm that only seemed to get louder the longer I stood there, unable to turn around, unable to face whatever had crept up behind me. Then, the softest sound. A tiny tap, tap, tap against the wooden floor. A movement. A step. I squeezed my eyes shut, every muscle in my body tensing as the noise sent a fresh wave of ice through my limbs. I didn't want to see it. I couldn't see it. If I turned around and saw that thing standing there, its porcelain face grinning up at me, those lifeless glass eyes locked onto mine, I knew something terrible would happen. The certainty of that knowledge filled every inch of my being, as undeniable as the air in my lungs, as real as the cold sweat slicking my skin. Another step. Closer this time. The shop was too silent, the absence of sound pressing against my ears like cotton, making every small movement feel deafening. I could hear the faintest rustle, as if fabric was shifting, as if tiny, delicate arms were stretching, as if something, not quite human, was adjusting itself, preparing to move again. I had to get out. Swallowing the thick lump in my throat, I forced my shaking hand toward the door handle, my fingers slipping against the cool brass. I didn't care if it was locked. I didn't care if it wouldn't budge. I just needed to try. I wrapped my fingers around the handle and pulled. Nothing. I pulled again, harder this time, desperation turning into full-blown panic as I yanked at the door, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The wood didn't even creak. It was like the entire thing had fused into the frame, like it had never been meant to open again. Behind me, the giggle came again. Closer. A choked sound slipped from my lips, something between a whimper and a sob. My entire body was trembling now, cold terror wrapping around me like a second skin, suffocating, inescapable. I knew it was right there, inches away, close enough that if I reached out, I would feel the smooth, cold surface of its porcelain skin. I couldn't do it. I couldn't turn around. The lights flickered once, then twice, casting long, twisting shadows across the room. I squeezed my eyes shut, silently willing it to stop, willing the door to open, willing something to let me escape this nightmare. Then, silence. The air changed again, the thick, suffocating pressure lifting just slightly, just enough for me to suck in a shallow breath. It was gone. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. The presence had retreated, slipping back into whatever dark place it had come from, leaving only the cold, heavy emptiness in its wake. I opened my eyes slowly, my vision swimming as I let out a shaky breath. My hands were still gripping the door handle, my knuckles white from the force of my grip. I didn't dare turn around completely, but I flicked my gaze toward the glass reflection. The figure was gone. The counter was still empty. The shop was still the same, frozen in time, untouched except for the lingering, suffocating weight of what had just happened. But I wasn't fooled. The doll was still here, somewhere, watching, waiting. I wasn't alone, and I knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning. I didn't move for a long time, standing there with my fingers still wrapped around the door handle, my breathing shallow and uneven, my body refusing to relax, even though the room had fallen silent once more. The absence of sound was almost worse than the giggle, worse than the tapping of tiny feet against the wooden floor. It made me feel like I was standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable, as if the shop itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. My eyes darted back to the reflection in the glass, scanning every inch of the shop, searching for any flicker of movement, any sign that the doll was still there, lurking in the shadows just beyond my sight. But there was nothing. Just rows and rows of dolls, their tiny faces pressed against the glass cases, their painted eyes reflecting the dim light, creating the terrible illusion that they were watching. I tried the door again, gripping the handle with both hands this time, twisting and pulling with every ounce of strength I had left. But it was useless. It didn't rattle, didn't budge, didn't give so much as a whisper of movement. It was as if it had never been meant to open, as if the moment I had stepped inside, something had shifted, trapping me in place, refusing to let me leave. A wave of frustration surged through me, overpowering my fear just enough to make me act. I turned sharply, my body tense, my eyes scanning the shop as I took a slow, unsteady step forward. If the doll had moved, if it had disappeared, then where had it gone? It couldn't just vanish. It had to be somewhere. And even though every rational part of my mind was screaming at me to stay still, to not go looking, I knew I couldn't just stand here, waiting for something to happen. I moved cautiously, my footsteps barely making a sound against the wooden floor, my fingers twitching at my sides, my senses sharpened by the suffocating weight of fear pressing down on my chest. My father's shop had always been small, just a single room with the workshop in the back. Nowhere for anything or anyone to hide. And yet somehow, I felt like I was being hunted, like something unseen was lurking just beyond the edges of my vision, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. I approached the nearest glass case, my breath fogging against the cool surface as I peered inside. The dolls inside were motionless, untouched, their porcelain faces frozen in placid expressions that sent a fresh wave of unease crawling down my spine. I moved to the next case, then the next, my stomach twisting tighter with every second that passed. Still no sign of the missing doll. Then, I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible rustling sound. My breath hitched as my head snapped toward the workshop door, my entire body locking up as the sound continued, soft and rhythmic, like the whisper of fabric brushing against wood. It was coming from inside the back room. For a long moment, I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Then, slowly, I took a step forward. The door to the workshop was still slightly ajar from when I had fled. The darkness beyond its threshold seeming thicker than before, almost tangible, like a living thing waiting for me to step inside. The rustling sound came again, low and deliberate, like something shifting in the shadows just beyond my sight. I knew I shouldn't go in there. I knew it. But I did. The workshop was colder than before, the scent of dust and something metallic clinging to the air, making my stomach twist with unease. The chair in the center of the room was empty now, the doll that had worn my face nowhere to be seen. My pulse pounded against my ribs as my eyes flickered across the cluttered space, over the rows of tiny tools, the scattered fabric, the lifeless glass eyes staring from their wooden compartments. And then I saw it. A small shadow near the farthest shelf, barely visible in the dim light. The missing doll. It was standing now, not slumped over like before, not resting lifelessly on a chair, but standing. Its tiny porcelain hands resting at its sides, its delicate face turned ever so slightly in my direction. I felt a thick, suffocating dread settle over me as I took in the sight of it, my pulse hammering against my skull. It hadn't been standing before. Dolls weren't supposed to stand on their own. I took a shaky step back, my fingers trembling at my sides. The doll tilted its head. A tiny, delicate movement, slow and deliberate, like it was studying me, like it was listening. I felt something cold brush against the back of my neck. I barely had time to react before the door behind me slammed shut. The sound of the door slamming shut behind me sent a jolt of pure terror through my body, my breath catching in my throat as I spun around, my hands fumbling blindly for the handle, for anything that would let me out. But my fingers met nothing but cold, unyielding wood. The door wouldn't budge. Not even an inch. It was as though the moment it had closed, the entire room had sealed itself shut, trapping me inside with whatever was in here with me. The air had changed again, thickening into something oppressive, something suffocating. The scent of dust and old wood had been overtaken by something else, something cloying and bitter that made my stomach churn. I turned back toward the doll, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, my pulse hammering so loudly I could hear it in my ears. It was still standing there, still watching me, its porcelain face eerily expressionless, its glassy eyes reflecting the dim light of the workshop. And then, in the suffocating silence, I heard it. Not a giggle this time. not the faint, distant sound of something lurking just beyond my sight. This was different. A whisper. It was low and delicate, barely more than a breath against my ears, but it sent a sharp, ice-cold terror slithering down my spine. I couldn't make out the words, couldn't even be sure if it was a language I understood, but the feeling of it was undeniable. It was speaking to me. The doll was speaking to me. I pressed myself back against the door, my entire body shaking, my hand scrambling desperately against the surface behind me, searching for a handle that wasn't there, for some way to escape. But there was nothing. The walls felt closer now, the air tighter, the room itself shifting, pressing in around me, leaving me nowhere to run. The whisper grew louder. The doll moved. Its tiny porcelain fingers twitched first, barely a fraction of an inch, but enough to make my breath stop cold in my throat. Then its head tilted further, slow and prescient. See, its glass eyes unblinking, locked onto mine with an intensity that sent a fresh wave of panic crashing through me. I wanted to look away, wanted to shut my eyes and pretend this wasn't happening. But I couldn't. It wouldn't let me. The whispering didn't stop. It grew, deepened, filling the air, echoing from the walls, overlapping, as though all of the dolls in the shop had begun speaking at once, their delicate voices weaving together into something dark, something unnatural. And then, finally, I understood. Not words, not exactly, but something deeper, something older, something that clawed its way into my mind and made itself known. My father's work. The thing he had always whispered about. The thing he had waited for me to finish. He hadn't just been making dolls. He had been making vessels. Vessels for them. The trapped souls. I felt it then. The weight of something pressing against my skin, against my bones. The feeling of something moving just beneath the surface. Something trying to slip inside. The dolls weren't just dolls. They were people. People who had been pulled into this place just like me. People who had wandered too close, who had touched what they shouldn't have, who had found themselves trapped. And now it was my turn. The whispering grew louder, the voices rising, filling my head, spilling into my thoughts, wrapping around my mind like fingers pressing deep into my skull. I could feel them clawing at me, pulling me apart piece by piece, reshaping me into something else, something new. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the doll. Standing before me, smiling now, its tiny lips curved into something almost human, and its eyes, pale, blue, the same color as mine. I woke up in the shop. The lights were on. The air was still. The door was open, the morning sunlight spilling in through the glass, casting long golden streaks across the wooden floor. For a moment, I didn't move, didn't breathe, just lay there on the floor, my body feeling strange, unfamiliar, as though I had been asleep for a very long time. Slowly, I pushed myself up, my limbs stiff, my head clouded, my thoughts sluggish and distant. Something felt off, but I couldn't quite place it. The shop looked the same as before. Dusty shelves, glass cases filled with porcelain faces, rows and rows of dolls sitting in their places, watching in eerie silence. I reached up to brush my hair from my face, but the moment my fingers touched my skin, I froze. It was smooth. Too smooth. Porcelain. A shudder ran through me. my breath catching as I slowly turned my hands over, staring at the delicate, perfectly sculpted fingers, at the joints that weren't joints at all, but tiny, seamless pieces fitted together with unnatural precision. I reached up again, hesitating before pressing my fingers against my cheek, my chest tightening as I felt the cool, solid texture beneath my touch. No skin, no warmth, just porcelain. The realization hit me like a blow, knocking the breath from my lungs, sending me reeling as I stumbled backward, my mind screaming, my thoughts a chaotic blur of panic and denial. But before I could make another move, before I could even begin to process the horror of what had happened to me, the bell above the shop door chimed. I turned sharply, my head moving too smoothly, too perfectly, my vision strangely sharp, too precise. A customer stood in the doorway, peering into the dimly lit shop, their expression hesitant, curious. And then, as if pulled by invisible strings, my lips curved into a smile. Behind me, the dolls whispered in unison, "Welcome."